to publicly question candidates ahead of the election. Members of the Legislative Council have also been invited to observe these proceedings, and I'm grateful to the President of Tynwald for allowing us to hold these hustings in the Legislative Council chamber. This makes it easier to make eye contact with the candidates as chair and allows us to use our trial of filming in this chamber to ensure this event is public. I will start by giving each candidate 3 minutes to make an opening statement, and will allow a similar 3 minutes for closing statements when it appears to me that an adequate opportunity has been given to ask questions, and certainly no later than 12:30. I would ask each candidate to keep their answers brief to allow as many questions as possible, but I will limit answers to 2 minutes to ensure this. Please wait to be introduced. This will allow me to regulate timing and ensure the camera is pointing in the right direction when you start speaking. There will be a short comfort break at about the half-time point. Members have, of course, been free to meet the candidates outside of the hustings, and candidates have taken the opportunity to write to members, which is perfectly acceptable. Once the candidates have given their opening statements, I'd appreciate it if honourable members could signify their wish to ask a question by raising their hands, and I will call on them in the order that they catch my eye. I'd appreciate it if members came forward to use the microphone at the front to ask their question. Can I ask everyone to take a moment to ensure their telephones are switched off or to silent? No fire alarms are scheduled, so if the alarm does go off, our quickest route out is via the historic staircase to my left. The order of speaking today has been put into a random order by the Clerk of Tynwald's office, and this session's candidates are Mr Perkins, Mr Henderson, Ms Newell, Ms Morfitt, Mr Mercer, Mr Cleater, Ms Bell and Mrs Sharp. And we begin with opening statements, and I will start with Mr Perkins.
Thank you. I've put myself forward for the position of Legislative Counsel because I'm confident in my experience of legislation and scrutiny would add value and balance to the work of LegCo. It's no secret I was not elected in the last election, and purely and simply that was on a case of principle. I could not support the pumping of sewage out of Laxey at a cost of £27 million. And that was back in 21. The risks and the rewards were not acceptable in my view, and it was a case of principle. Consequently, I didn't get re-elected. But in every event, I got more votes than some of the members that actually got returned the keys. It's a constituency issue, obviously, but I did get more votes than some people that actually got returned. In the keys, I successfully put through 3 bills: the organ donating and human tissue bill, the ban on sale and release of sky lanterns and the outdoor release of helium balloons, and also the competition bill. No other MHK backbencher achieved its difficult task of putting 3 bills through with the Brexit legislation that we had to do, and also latterly COVID. Now, disappointingly, one of my reasons for standing for LegCo is that here we are 5 years down the line, 5 years, and we still haven't got the secondary legislation done. Quite frankly, it is unbelievable that we find ourselves in this position, and to add insult to injury, Tesco walk in with no government virus to carry out an investigation or ability to put any sanctions against Tesco. That's just unbelievable in my view, incredible. Nobody picked it up, no LegCo member picked it up, no Keys member picked it up, and nobody in government picked it up. We have failed quite drastically. Had I been in the Keys, I would have undoubtedly followed it through, admittedly because it was my baby. But somebody should be following this secondary legislation and lifting stones to see what other secondary legislation is languishing in the same place as this has. Honourable members, my Keys experience has given me the skills, the knowledge, the proven ability and the fire in my belly to get into LegCo with no learning curve and to be able to start from day one. Thank you.
Mr Henderson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I've been a long-standing member of the Manx Parliament, Tynwald, being a member of the House of Keys initially and for the majority of this period, and latterly the Legislative Council. This has enabled me to build an extensive political experience base built from a working knowledge of legislation, national strategic policies, departmental and various government and Tynwald committee roles and memberships. My political portfolio is comprehensive, in-depth, positive and dynamic, which includes an extensive working experience of legislation from its inception, construction, examination and scrutiny to presenting and moving legislation such as the Bank Recovery and Resolution Act 2020, which had 171 clauses. The Beneficial Ownership Bill and Abortion Reform Bill are also bills I moved. This includes presenting secondary legislation to Tynwald, a portfolio that contains the presentation and moving of national strategic policy, such as the new Manx single-tier state pension. It has empowered me to provide a proven, positive, constructive examination and scrutiny role of such matters as international and national policies, budgetary, finance and economic initiatives. This combines a wide range of appropriate skills forged through experience and training which I can bring to the Legislative Council. Importantly, I can bring those competences from a base of proven interpersonal communication skills, ability, hard work, tenacity and vision. A skills-based competency set, a strong continuity factor and valued experience which would be a significant asset. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Ms Newell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to take a few moments to introduce myself. I've lived on the Isle of Man since early 2003, when my late husband and I moved for work. Having visited numerous times over the years prior to moving, I always felt it was home to me, so I was delighted when we moved permanently. I've worked in the civil service since I arrived and have had numerous roles throughout my career, during which I've gained the knowledge and experience I feel are necessary for this role. I've also been a foster carer, a member of the Legal Aid Appeals Tribunal, a TT Marshal, and have held many other roles which have led me to sitting here in front of you today. Being in the political arena has been a long-held goal of mine. I have the drive and determination to make my place on the Legislative Council count. The island and its people are important to me, and whilst I'm in public service currently, I have so much more to give, and the role of MLC would provide that platform, and perhaps more notably will benefit every resident on the island. My interests are varied, but lean towards the health and education of our residents. Mental health is a big issue on our island, and I want to do more to assist people who are struggling and those left behind after a suicide. I would like the prevention strategy published last year revisited and potentially reworked in conjunction with the relevant charities and stakeholders to make a fully working document that actually benefits everyone. It's listed on our island plan, and we should be reviewing it every 12 months to ensure it's still fit for purpose. In the education arena, access to education is important. Basic numeracy and literacy is something everyone in this room takes for granted. Sadly, there are children in our schools who are falling behind as they don't meet the current criteria to obtain assistance. This area needs work to ensure we pick up every child who is struggling. And looking onwards from that to school leavers, the recent push on apprenticeships was great to see, but we need to encourage more investment in this area, taking into account the Island Plan initiatives on renewable energy. I hope that my answers to your questions this morning enable you to see the level of commitment I would have for the role if I'm successful. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Ms Morford.
Thank you. Moramai, Mr. Speaker, Chief Minister, honourable members and fellow nominees. I am very grateful to Mr Callister, Dr Allenston, Mr Glover and Ms Farragher for lending me their support and enabling me to reach this stage in the process, and I thank you all for the opportunity to speak to you today. I am a mum to a grown and now married daughter still living on island, a wife to a businessman and sports fanatic, a daughter to a mother who moved to live with us during COVID, and a proud and doting dog mum. Family is very important to me, and this value and the corresponding experiences are something that will be part of any role that I undertake. The impact of legislation on Manx families and how individuals are enabled to flourish should be a key consideration within the role of MLC. I have now lived on the Isle of Man for nearly 20 years. My dad's side of the family were Manx, and I grew up with wonderful stories of the Maudie Doo, the Little People, the Fairy Bridge, cars breaking down if you didn't say the proper salutations. The island always seemed like such a magical place, and even after all these years, it still does. I feel very privileged to be able to call this my home and to have raised my daughter here. An MLC holds a crucial role, providing independent scrutiny with the aim of ensuring that good legislation is developed. This good legislation is essential to the credibility of the island on the international stage, to protecting Manx citizens, offering services and support, and ensuring equality and inclusion. It is necessary to create a just and fair society for all. My skills developed throughout my career and higher education all evidence my ability to fulfil this duty, including research, information gathering, analysis, risk assessment and management, critical thinking and evidence-based decision-making, multi-agency working and communication skills. My CV clearly demonstrates that public service is something I believe in and is very important to me. Social work is not an easy job, made more difficult by public perception and media portrayal. However, I have enjoyed a very long career in frontline social work, a quarter of a century in frontline roles when research has found that the current average working lifespan is 7 years. This evidences my resilience and tenacity, my passion for the Manx people, my core belief that change is always possible, and my ability to build positive working relationships with the public and professionals alike. The description of MLC as a critical friend is a role that being a social worker has truly prepared me for. The ability to challenge and support whilst maintaining positive working relationships are key skills essential in both roles. Respect and unconditional positive regard are core components in making this work. The need to ask the right questions, even when these are difficult, and the need to defend my assessment in a respectful and supportive manner. I look forward to answering your questions and further evidencing my suitability for this role.
Perfect timing. Next, Mr. Mercer.
Thank you. I offer myself as candidate for election to the Legislative Council. My skills and prior experience will allow me to bring an additional perspective to the scrutiny of legislation and government. My decision to stand is driven by 3 key factors: my deep commitment to the Isle of Man, my belief that my skill set is well suited to the role, and my recognition that public service is both an opportunity and a responsibility. I was born in Liverpool and I lived there until 1998, when my wife and I made the decision to move to the Isle of Man with our daughter. This was more than just a career move, it was a commitment to a wonderful community and a way of life. I took up a role with a leading finance company based in Castletown, and from that point forward I've been deeply invested in the island's success. During my career I've gained experience across multiple sectors, including local government, financial services, e-gaming, and of course running my own small businesses, and more recently of course as a member of Legislative Council. For the past 5 years I've had the honour of serving as a member of the Legislative Council. Throughout my tenure I've worked diligently to provide meaningful scrutiny and informed contributions to key debates. My parliamentary record demonstrates my commitment to active participation, and I've been entrusted by my peers with roles on a number of important committees and boards. For the past 2.5 years, I've also served within DHA as their second departmental member, gaining further valuable experience in policy oversight and governance, as well as a deeper understanding of the challenges faced by this important part of the machinery of government. I thrive in environments that require rapid adaptation, critical thinking, and decision-making, skills that I believe are essential in legislative scrutiny and governance. Absorbing new knowledge, managing change, and identifying areas for improvement have been at the core of my professional journey. I believe these abilities, combined with my business experience, will continue to complement the skill sets of members of the Legislative Council. A number of MLCs have highlighted the importance of their role as a critical friend, and I've consistently demonstrated that I can provide such challenge when required and support when needed. Honourable members, the Legislative Council has an important role to play in our system of governance. If re-elected, I will continue to bring diligence, honesty and commitment to this responsibility. I welcome your scrutiny today, and should I be given the opportunity, I pledge to serve with integrity, a collaborative spirit and a steadfast focus on the challenges ahead. Guru Mayu.
Thank you. Mr. Cleaser.
Mr. Speaker, honourable members, Chief Minister, in the next 3 minutes I hope to give you an outline of why I am putting myself forward to be a member of the Legislative Council and what I feel I have to offer. For 26 years I have operated my own small businesses, and these continue to exist without my daily input. I hold non-executive positions with several companies on the island, and I work on a consultative basis for firms operating within retail, gaming, manufacturing and export, commercial and residential property letting, information technology and sound and broadcast engineering. In the late 80s, I had a position in the General Registry, and during that time I was a Commissioner for Oaths. I was also an active board member of Deemster Corrin's Manx Workshop for the Disabled for many years. My world has always been one of meticulous attention to detail in all that I undertake. It will not have gone unnoticed by some members that I was troubled with a contentious property dispute for some 10 years. This resulted in an enforced involvement with the world of the Acts of Tynwald and the intricacies involved. For 7 years, I personally had to scrutinise the considerable amounts of legislation, and such exposure being a baptism by fire into the world of law. That situation is now behind me, but it has left me with a much greater understanding of how our legislation affects the ordinary person. I am cognizant of the exact role that a member of the Legislative Council has. That is, the careful, diligent and detailed scrutiny of legislation that, if wrong, can potentially ruin a person's life. It is thus incumbent on all members to ensure that our Manx legislation is fit for purpose, and of course our elected representatives are charged with introducing most, but not all, of the island's fresh law. This is a huge task for the 24 MHKs and 11 MLCs to undertake, but with dedication and public consultation, it seems to work. Of course, I would be very willing to undertake any other roles that I might be offered, such as select committee membership or even departmental positions. If the honourable members decide to elect me, I have no doubt that I will add a very serious element to the council and will be able to bring a broad church of real-world knowledge to the table when spending time with other members deliberating upon their particular challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bell.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker and honourable members. I have a degree in mental health nursing and a postgraduate diploma in high-intensity cognitive behavioural therapy. I deliver the #1 treatment option as cited by NICE guidelines in the treatment of depression and anxiety disorders. The reason I chose to enhance my skills was to deliver evidence-based practice at the highest level and to be more efficient, qualities that will be invaluable to the role of MLC. I completed my qualifications as a mature student with children and a full-time job. So I have a proven track record of having lots of different responsibilities and performing well with the competing demands. My experience in mental health is broad. I have worked in secondary care and tertiary care in step 2, 3 and 4 of the stepped care model. I've worked in the hospital and the community for older people and the adult population. And I enjoy working in a multidisciplinary team, putting the patient at the centre of all decisions, which is a skill that is invaluable and will in supporting keys to meet the needs of island residents. And I value making a positive difference to individuals and communities on the Isle of Man and have been doing so since a young age. Just a few examples are beach cleaning, raising money for charity, sponsoring a child in Bulgaria and visiting her. I also organised and took families with terminally ill children to go on their dream holiday to Florida. And I gained sponsorship to go to the world's most successful drug and alcohol therapeutic community in the world to find out what makes them successful. And I presented the findings to drug and alcohol services here on the Isle of Man. Helping people really is in my blood. My most recent achievement is petitioning over a 4-year period to improve identification and support for children with dyslexia. I created Dyslexia Advocacy Group, IOM. I established relationships with the public, government, local, national and international charities and businesses. My efforts led to the Department of Education, Sports and Culture purchasing a 5-year licence from a world-leading provider in assistive technology for 11,000 pupils, enough for every child. And this was achieved with financial discipline in mind, as the company absorbed most of the costs because of the relationship I had built with them. My efforts also led to a select committee being established. I am ambitious and I believe I can do more. I will thrive at the challenges of making a difference at a population level, which is my main reason for applying. I understand the complexities and multifaceted nature of meeting government objectives and targets. For example, a person's vulnerability to developing a mental illness is determined by many variables, including our health service, housing, education, transport, food, our economy and our environment. All of these.
So, thank you very much. Mrs Sharp.
Mr Speaker, Chief Minister, honourable members, I am Kerry Sharp, and for the past 7 years I've had the pleasure and the privilege of serving alongside you as a member of the Legislative Council. I am here today because I want to deliver on the important work we've already started in helping to improve the quality of life for the people of the Isle of Man. As a member of the Legislative Council, I have scrutinised 81 pieces of legislation, successfully taken bills through Council for the Department of Health and Social Care and the Cabinet Office, and enhanced our legislation by making small but significant amendments to bills, including the Abortion Reform Bill, the Communications Bill and the Employment Amendment Bill. In Tynwald, I've debated a range of subjects and have introduced topics for debate, defending my arguments in what I trust is an informed and respectful manner. As a member of the Departments of Health and Social Care and Infrastructure, I developed a solid understanding of government departments, chaired committees and used that knowledge to enhance my scrutiny. I know about policy and procedure, about structure and governance. I know about the legislative process, from drafting instructions through to final bill. By completing the McGill Advanced Parliamentary Governance course and working my way through 81 pieces of legislation, I have learned to make sure that the legislation we are passing is in the best possible shape for the people of the Isle of Man. Honourable members, I am pleased to be here as a proud Manx woman and say that over the past 7 years, with your support, I have got things done. My work has led to the Notfield Inquiry, new legislation, the reinstatement of personal educational plans for all children who are in care, and as Children's Champion, a guarantee of continuous foster carer recruitment. My aim to enhance our communication led to the first Tynwald Public Engagement Strategy, and as Tynwald's first ever representative on the Commonwealth Parliamentarians with Disabilities Network, I have successfully gained funding to improve our accessibility with more funding on the way. Most of all, I'm pleased to have helped grow new positive relationships between Tynwald members and underrepresented groups, and it's something I would like the opportunity to advance further. I might not have been able to change the past, but working together with colleagues, I have been able to make the future better for some. Honourable members, I believe I have been effective and I have delivered. I have a solid foundation of knowledge and experience, and I'm ready to commit to the next 5 years. I hope you will give me the opportunity to continue our work together. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll turn to questions. The first person to have caught my eye was Ms Christian. If I can ask you to come to the microphone, or have the microphone come to you, whichever works.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Could you give a brief example of a piece of legislation, either current bill or past act, which you believe has an unintended consequence, and could you expand?
Bill from the past that has an unintended consequence. Now, in terms of staggering things, we'll turn first to Mr Henderson, and we'll carry on the same loop, finishing on this occasion with Mr Perkins. So, Mr Henderson, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank Mrs Christian for the question, most interesting. One bill of quite a few that jumps out is the beneficial ownership bill, which came to the Legislative Council, which I took through, and from the outset it became very apparent that some of the detail was actually going to, or have the potential to, adversely affect local small Manx businesses, and representations were made at that point just on the first reading, and it generated many consultations between government, private sector. It caused me to go and meet the external relations officers at the time, because there was a push from the UK as well that we should have this legislation in their view. International reputation, you have to have it. But we managed to negotiate our way through that, so that we had a soft landing with this in a staged approach, which actively assisted our local business, but also able to educate them as to the whys and the wherefores of it. So it progressed a lot more smoothly, and we were able to take out some of the unintended consequences that were being flagged up to us.
If I could just also point out to members in the gallery that that microphone is there. It is permanently live, so just ask you to not talk in the gallery as well whilst we're carrying on. Next, Ms Newell. Pass, no problem. Ms Morfitt.
Okay, so I will choose a piece of legislation that I use every day in work. So that's the current health and social care legislation. There are two statements within that legislation that entitle people to care and support, whether they have disabilities or whether they are elderly. The first statement is that they have to have the ability to fund, which in reality means that the only people that can get the support through Manx Care are people who are rich or are on income support. So that leaves a huge portion of the population unable to fund their care. So people, I will give an example, obviously anonymised, of a lady who worked part-time whilst she was raising her children, so had a very, very small pension. She was dying, wanted to die at home. She went home, she couldn't get income support because she had £50 too much. £50 a week does not pay for someone to come in 3 times a day. And that is how we send our population home. The second statement within that is that you can receive care if you evidence that you have a grave need. This has not been defined in legislation or in case law, so in reality it means that it's the decision of one manager. You do your appeal to one manager, you evidence it, and they will make their decision, and there is no way to appeal that decision. Even through safeguarding, referrals to safeguarding have been refused because they don't consider the institutional nature of safeguarding.
Thank you very much. Mr Mercer.
Thank you for the question. In terms of unintended consequences, I can't at this point in time think of a particular example, but it's important to note that as part of scrutiny, when you're looking through a bill as it progresses through its stages, you are trying to identify those in advance. So although I can't give you an example, I think that's a key part of the role of scrutiny.
Thank you. Mr Keeter.
Well, for fear of the honourable members thinking I might be coming here with an agenda, everything is behind me, but the one example that brought me here was a problem within the Land Registration Act regarding trusts, and specifically the exclusion of a clause that was in the English version of the similar act. Having excluded protection for trusts within the Manx law, it left a massive gaping hole which, when abused, was capable of allowing landlocking and effectively giving land away using adverse possession. Adverse possession is incredibly complicated, and most people basically say that it's a very complicated area of law, and that appears to be the excuse for it being hard to sort out. But had English legislation been used or referred to a lot closer and not miss clauses out, then perhaps I wouldn't be sitting here today having had to read 10 years worth of legislation in the land area. So missing out legislation that's already been discussed by the Lords, by the MPs and the Lords in England, seems to be very unwise, as again there's an awful lot of them and there's not very many of us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms Bell.
Thank you for your question. The most obvious one for me that comes to mind is the assisted dying bill. The reason I am suggesting that there's a risk of unintended consequences is my background in mental health. I know that people who are nurses, doctors, farmers, those types of people, they are more likely to end their own lives by suicide compared to the general population, simply because they have access to drugs and machinery that can end their own life. So an unintended consequence that needs to be safeguarded would be for a pharmacist or a nurse or a health professional. using the drugs themselves to end their own life. So Manx Care, or the Department of Education, Sports and Culture, when they roll out the assisted dying bill, would need to make sure that, which of course they will, to make sure that, you know, that is safeguarded against, you know, perhaps having 2 people at all times with that medication, perhaps having it off island, so it's not actually on the Isle of Man, and only order it in once when it's needed, because there won't be many times it is needed, perhaps only, you know, a handful a year. And also another risk could be that although there are safeguards to protect against this, you know, patients need to make sure they have the settled, clear intention. The risk is that they might be under duress or undue influence, and obviously there are safeguards around this, or mental health, or feel like they are a burden. And I think that I'm really pleased to see that perhaps, I think in 2 years' time, there's going to be a like a post-legislative scrutiny panel to make sure that that it's fit for purpose, that it's working, that the safeguards are working. I think it's healthy.
Mrs. Sharp.
Thank you, and thank you to Minister Christian for her question. I think I would choose the domestic abuse bill as an example. When it came through to Legislative Council, it meant that children could be charged with domestic abuse, and myself and colleagues within Council felt that this was wrong. We felt that if domestic abuse was occurring in a household, then it was a health and social care issue, and it would be wrong to criminalise children or young people. Now, the Chief Constable at the time gave the example of a young person who had actually ended up breaking his mother's back, and that something had to be done in this kind of situation. But actually, what transpired later when children and families went into that family was that there was a history of ongoing abuse that had occurred. So the AG's chambers wouldn't prosecute a child anyway unless it was in the public interest to do so. And there were orders and notices within the bill which could be served on a child or an adult, for example, to prevent a perpetrator from re-entering the family home. However, what we felt in Legislative Council was, if it was a child who had carried out the domestic abuse, where would they go if they were prevented from entering the family home? And children and families certainly said that they would not be putting any such child in the secure unit. So there was a conference of the branches called, and I was one of the people elected to go to that rare occasion, and there was discussion with House of Keys, but House of Keys were adamant that they wanted to stick to the bill as it was. And actually, you know, it's an interesting example in that that's democracy in progress, in action, because the House of Keys is the elected branch, and so that was fine. But I think that what will probably happen with Legislative Council is that in our post-legislative scrutiny committee, we will be looking at that bill to see how that has gone.
Thank you. Mr. Perkins.
Thank you. What you're talking about is the Cobra effect, and that was first observed in Hanoi in French Indochina. And the authorities realised that longtails were spreading disease. So what they did was they put in sewers to try and clear it up. The disease dropped for a while, but then actually the longtails were using it as super highways to get disease all around the city, not just in pockets. So then the authority says, right, we're going to pay a bounty on longtails' tails and cut it that way. Again, it stopped the disease for a long time, but suddenly they found out that the longtails were actually being farmed. And that is the classic Cobra effect. Coming back to the Isle of Man, one of the things is, then it's regulation more than actual laws, is the dilemma about minimum wage. If you put minimum wage up, the employers reduce the number of employees they take on. So it's a very, very careful balancing. The other thing that springs to my mind is it was put through with the best of intentions, but the landlord and tenants bill actually has had the effect of landlords selling up and getting out of the rental property, which has the effect of putting up the rental charges for people that can least afford it. Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay, so our next question is in the hands of Mr. Glover. And then I have Mrs. Kane after that, and then I have an open book. So, Mr. Glover.
Gurumad Lauder. We hear a lot at the moment about government efficiency, so I'm just going to ask, what do you understand by that term, and how would you contribute to a debate on government efficiency?
How would you understand and contribute to a debate on government efficiency? First up, Ms Newell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr Glover, for your question. I've spent 22 years in various government departments, and yes, I think sometimes when you're new in post, you see a lot of things that perhaps could change, a lot of things that could be done differently and more efficiently. I think initially getting an idea of the processes that are already in place and the things that are already in place is perhaps the best way to start, and then work from there, looking at things like process maps, etc., on a very basic level, working up to budgetary constraints, etc. So I think certainly just getting used to what's going on in the department where you are, and then working from that. And I guess that comes from a very basic admin perspective, looking at that level all the way up to the top.
Thank you very much. Ms Morford.
So obviously financial discipline is a core aspect of the Island Plan, which is the policy that all the MHKs have voted for and agreed. So it's something that is very important. I had to work very hard when I was young as a mum going to university and waitressing at TGI Fridays to pay the mortgage. You learn personally how to budget. You know the consequences of not budgeting. And this is no different on a macro scale. This isn't our money, this is the public's money, and we have a very serious responsibility to get that right. So I think one of the things that, in answer to your question, I would look at is actually what are the mandated services. I think as a public servant, what is expected of us keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. And it is impossible then to manage a budget. I think debates need to happen on what actually are those mandated services, because we cannot provide everything as prices increase, wages increase. We cannot provide everything. So the debate needs to be about what are we going to provide.
Thank you very much. Mr Mercer.
Thank you for the question. I mean, government efficiency, another word really is productivity. I think the two go hand in hand. There are two ways of driving productivity. And I can use a personal example, I think, from my time in the finance sector. It was a bottom-up driven approach, and it was quite simple. There was a whiteboard in each of the areas, and they wrote down the top 5 niggles or annoyances or things that were stopping them from moving work through rapidly. And it worked incredibly effectively. We kept on knocking down those niggles and just improving those processes. When you improve processes, you can get more work done. You improve productivity, and basically that is driving efficiency. So just from that personal example, bottom-up approach does work, but you need the strategy at the top of that to provide you with a framework for that to function under.
Thank you. Mr Cleater.
I noticed from the budget that Dr Allinson has allocated £5 million this year for automating government processes. I presume that that's probably because the civil service is too high, the head count of the civil service. The public are incredibly frustrated by the cost of running the civil service, and obviously allocating £5 million sounds like a lot, but actually if that can reduce the amount of employees by natural wastage or whatever, then that can only be a good thing. The other problem, I also noticed the other day that 15 bills have been rescinded or cancelled, or they're not going to go ahead for whatever reason. One must say that the Attorney General's office must have put an awful lot of work into those bills already, and that's a phenomenal waste. So I'm not experienced enough yet to know how all these bills arrive and for what purpose, whether they're pet projects or whether they're really important. And once they get written up, the ones that I'm reading seem to be very, very, very detailed, so they're not exactly plain English. So once things get so complicated that normal people can't read them, you then need to have a lot in place to be able to enact them, enforce them, whatever. So simplification would be my number one priority across the board if I was involved. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Bell.
Okay, so efficiency to me refers to quality and being able to get more done in less time, which goes back to what Mr. Mercer was saying about productivity. One way of achieving that is reducing bureaucracy, but not to the point where it compromises quality or safety or standards. It's about streamlining processes, sharing ideas, and having priorities, knowing what are all the things that we need to do and just setting a priority. A couple of initiatives that government are trying to do at the moment to improve efficiency is introducing AI, and the recruitment control framework, I guess, is about controlling recruitment and then allowing what you have got and maximising that. I noticed that there's also a committee currently at Tynwald. It's the Standing Committee of the Legislative Council, which I think was designed to improve efficiency. And one way that it did that, one example, was that now when amendments are made, you get to see what amendments have been made, and it adds context to the amendment process. One way that I would add to efficiency is by, I suppose, front loading as much as I can and learning quickly as fast as I can, and certainly reading the documents that the Standing Committee of Legislative Council has done, which was a select committee and has moved to a standing committee, so it's been very successful. And contributing to that standing committee when I learn and have experience, and I'll contribute towards that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Sharp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to Mr. Glover. So what is government efficiency? I mean, I would say that it's producing a quality product in a smooth and timely manner. I think that the first thing that springs to mind when I think about government efficiency is how many people are involved in the civil service. It is the largest employer on the island. I think that probably we don't need as many people working. I mean, when I think about having worked in government departments, sometimes there are people that are actually spending a great deal of time photocopying documents, and that shouldn't really be necessary in this day and age. Also, I think we need to look at how many people within the civil service are on long-term sick. I know that this is something that Dr. Allenson is looking into in terms of young people in general on the island. But thousands of working days are lost from Isle of Man government through people being mostly either depressed or having musculoskeletal issues. So I think that possibly looking at workplace access to counselling. I mean, I know these services are available, but really pushing those, pushing walking to work, pushing being more active is going to improve our efficiency. Data collection is another thing. In the recent engineering and manufacturers report, into the island, into that sector, there was no data available on how many people in the island are involved with research and development. So often in government you can't just press a button and get information. IT services, there are over 1,000 different systems in place within Isle of Man government. In the hospital you have nurses trying to log into 3 different systems in order to log information about one patient. GDPR isn't fully understood yet within government, and so a lot of information which should be shared, for example between DHSC and Manx Care, isn't being shared. Thank you.
Sure. Next, Mr. Perkins.
Thank you. One of the problems we've got is a massive civil servant body out of disproportion to the population we've got. And to be absolutely brutal on it, we have managers managing managers, and it just cannot carry on. We're living in cloud cuckoo land. we need to use AI to reduce some of this problem. And it's going to be drastic. It's going to be a bloodbath in many ways because it is coming down the line. Now, one of the things I can see that's going to be cropping up is radon gas. And there's a bit of noise about it at the moment. And my view, what will happen is there will be inspectors, there will be regulators, there'll be people all involved. We'll bring all these people in because we're frightened about radon gas. And what we need to do is to say to the public, look, if you've got a house with a void under your floor, open the windows and make sure there's ventilation. End of story. Government should not get involved with that. We try and manage the public too closely because we don't think they've got the sense to sort themselves out. When I put the organ donation bill through, it became apparent, looking wider, that it also would affect the human tissue legislation, which went way back before the Alder Hay children's organ scandal. So what I actually did was go to the hospital and I looked at what was happening with the organ donating process at the coalface. And it became apparent with the human tissue issue, I had to go and talk to the people in the mortuary, and I also had to talk to people in the path lab and roll it all up into one. And to streamline things, you talk to people that are actually giving the service to the public, actually doing the work, not the backroom boys that they, you know, the frontline workers have to go and say, can we do this, can we do that? Well, actually, if you need to do it, get on and do it. In engineering, if you need a tool to do a job, don't go back up the line, get that tool and start saving us money. And this is what we have to bring into government. It's going to be difficult.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perkins. Mr. Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Glover. Efficiency, and if we're looking at government efficiency, which I think your question's directed at, I think we're looking at a service that government provides. Is that service value for money? Does it meet quality standards? Is it fit and proper for what it was intended to do in the first place? And it needs to be measured, and we need to have KPIs behind the scenes structured against each action that government is delivering to the public, so that in fact efficiency and objectives are being measured to see that they are being met, and that will soon tell you if that particular activity, action, public service is efficient. But there's another side to the coin here. We're a small island of 85,000 people in the middle of the Irish Sea. Sometimes I feel our expectations go way beyond what our small community is able to sustain. And I think it's high time that government looked at what we are offering for a small community and educate the public for actually what it is that we do need and the public expectation. I feel sometimes that we're more responsive to expand more and more and more and more, when in fact we do need to be looking at becoming more and more and more efficient in what we're doing, and indeed how are we going to offer what we're doing in more and effective ways, not keep expanding it all the time. I don't think that's the way forward either. Mr. Mercer's taken the words out of my mouth with productivity management. And also, whatever we do needs to be transparent and open to scrutiny so that the public and other bodies, Tynwald, the House of Keys, Legco, can see exactly.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Our next question is in the hands of Mrs. Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for putting yourselves forward for the Legislative Council. So my question is, why Legislative Council? Why are you putting yourself forward for the upper chamber and rather than House of Keys? And second part of the question, if unsuccessful, would you consider standing for the House of Keys next year?
I'm not sure about the second part of that question, but in terms of why the Legislative Council, then then we are first up this time is Miss Morford.
Okay, so not one I'd prepared for, so there you go. Why the Legislative Council is because that is my skill set. It is what I am passionate about. I have seen firsthand legislation working with the Manx population. I've seen how important it is. I've seen how it can let people down. I've seen how in a court you can be arguing for things. I've sat in coroner's courts and watched Section 34 recommendations being made that aren't then followed through. I've sat in Section 8 inquiry results with things that are recommended that haven't been followed through and seem to be forgotten years later. So that is why the Legislative Council, because it suits my set of skills. Why not the Keys? Because that doesn't suit my set of skills. I am a very passionate person. I have very, very clear core values that are within my social work qualification as well. And I have stood for Legislative Council to be independent, to be able to scrutinise independently and to be able to challenge and support. Whereas in the House of Keys, I understand that I would be representing the population that have voted for me. And I am not positive how I would do that, and it's not something I've ever considered.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mercer.
Thank you for the question. I'm drawn to the scrutiny aspects of the MLC role, and I know that my skill set is better suited to that. I've got an eye for detail, procedure and process. I've always wanted to understand how things work, what makes them tick, and probably quite importantly, what can make them break or what bits are missing. And you know, and I think that is more of a it's more of an advisory rather than an executive role. So I think that's the first part of the question. The second part, I know I would not consider standing as an MHK.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cleater.
I have already been in extensive conversations with many people about standing as an MHK. I was going to do that in 18 months, but I had a lot of people suggesting that Legislative Council might suit me better. Quiet contemplation and detailed scrutiny of legislation is what I've been doing, and so that skill translates over to what Legislative Council actually does. If I'm not elected into Legislative Council, then I will be standing as an MHK in 18 months' time. Simple as that.
Thank you. Ms. Bell.
Thank you for the question. I'm going to be really honest that I think that I am suited to an MHK role and an MLC role. I've been encouraged probably for the last 5 years that I could make a good MHK because I do like to drive change in policies. You've seen me do that with the work I've done with dyslexia. However, that's my... In terms of the MHK, it was also driven because I didn't really know what an MLC did. So I spent a lot of time over the last 6 months to understand what an MLC does. I met with an MLC back in summer last year to start my inquiry about what an MLC does. And so my understanding has improved, and looking at some of the bills that get passed that have really helped at a population level are things like the Reproductive Rights Bill, the Assisted Dying Bill, Domestic Abuse Bill, even the Equality Act, going back 2017. So there's huge changes at a population level, and I feel like I would really like to contribute to making a difference at a population level, which is my reason for applying. However, if I'm not successful in becoming part of LegCo, I think I might stand as an MHK. I don't want to say definitely, because 18 months away is quite a far time, so I don't want to absolutely commit, but it is something that has crossed my mind, and I just wanted to be really honest about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Sharp.
Thank you to Mrs. Kane for her question. The reason why I'm standing for LegCo is that I do believe that I have the right skills and the right personality to be a useful MLC. Previous to Legislative Council, I had a TV career where I made documentaries and I wrote for the broadsheets. And I really am more of a behind the camera kind of person. I'm happier to be one step back and to be looking at what's going on. I think I said to one of the members recently that I'm not interested in news until it's at least a day old. I like to have that one step removed perspective. I'm very happy to be able to lock the door and just devote myself to legislative scrutiny. It's a bit sad, but each bill is like a whole new world, and I think that this appeals to what I found interesting in the world of television. So if you're looking at domestic abuse, suddenly you get really, really, really into domestic abuse, and then if you're looking at whatever that topic is, you get the chance to really dive into that world and to ask questions, and to investigate, and to think about who might be affected by this bill and in what way they're going to be affected. I'm very, very meticulous. I left Ramsey Grammar School to go to the University of Cambridge to study English, and I had to cope with an awful lot of analysis and scrutiny as a student looking at the whole canon of English literature. I'm very tenacious, and if I do think that something isn't right, I will just keep going and keep going and keep going until I get to the bottom of that issue. I haven't thought about standing for the keys. I know...
By the bell. That's next. Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I miss the cut and thrust of the political arena of Tynwald, and I think I can contribute to LegCo because I happen to believe that Legislative Council used to be full of politicians that came up from the Keys, and I think the barometer has swung too far away from that, and we have members of LegCo who have no Keys experience, and I believe that we should redress the balance. I think that the stick I'm going to get on social media for actually having put myself forward, somehow people with the political experience are disbarred from something, and I don't think that's right, and I think on a case of principle I would put myself forward because of that and be spurred on. And the other issue is that I'm annoyed that secondary legislation hasn't been completed on the organ donating bill and also on the competition bill, and that secondary legislation needs sorting. Now, MHKs, you've got a lot on your plate, you've got all your constituency work which is gathering momentum, you're coming up to an election, and you just haven't got the time to investigate these things in detail. There's probably a lot of legislation in there where the secondary hasn't been done, and I believe that if I'm elected onto the LegCo, I will be turning up a few stones and seeing what secondary legislation hasn't been completed. The answer to the question, will I go for the keys, depending on how bruised I am when I come out of this side of this election, I shall make a decision then. Probably if I don't get elected, I may well stand for the keys, but I shall have to make a decision then. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to Mrs. Kane for the question. I would say, considering I've done 4 House of Keys general elections now under my belt, I felt it was time to look at the other legislative dynamic within Tynwald, which is the Legislative Council. And actually, as we've heard, it gives me a chance to stand back and look at legislation, policy, in an overview, strategic point of view, rather than a more operationally active role within the House of Keys. It gives me a chance to quality check, give things a second look, make sure that what we are producing from the Legislative Council that has come through from the primary house, the House of Keys, is fit for purpose, because at the end of the day what we pass affects everybody in our community to one degree or another. I can also, with that, if I was elected, I can hit the ground running. I've got a full general working knowledge of the Legislative Council, Tynwald policies and procedures, a wide range and deep background working knowledge and experience, which is forged in Keys and Legislative Council. I can bring continuity and stability. I can also say that I am absolutely an advocate for change, and I see that a parliament can't stand still. We have to move forward, and the world is changing around us, and so must we in challenging times. But I don't see change for change's sake. It's got to be relevant, appropriate, and bring benefit to our community. I've a proven positive track record in skill sets required to function in the role of an MLC, transparency and openness. I have no other conflicts of interest, no other remunerated roles, and I've always treated this job, whether in the House of Keys...
Sorry, Mr. Anderson. Thank you very much. Mr. Newell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mrs. Kane, for your question. So, in order to answer that, my knowledge and skills are more suited to LegCo. I have strong analytical skills and enjoy the detail and picking out those points that may be contentious or controversial. My drafting experience and all the tasks that came with that also provide a good grounding for this role and was probably the start of my journey to now. I'm strong and independent. I stand up for the underdog and I will question where others may not and continue until I get the answers. I'm honest, open and approachable and absolutely committed to this role. My postgraduate studies in public service also provided further knowledge in this arena. I've been through a number of difficult years recently and kind of finding myself again, but the time is right for me now to put myself forward for this. In terms of the House of Keys, I thought about it, but my skills lean more towards LegCo, so not at this time, but I would never rule it out.
Thank you very much. Our next question is in the hands of Ms. Edge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask all candidates with regards to conflicts of interest and also any affiliations or with associations or clubs of any sort, how would you declare those conflicts and ensure that your legislative work was impartial?
So conflicts of interest and affiliations. First one on this one is Mr. Mercer. Do you want to start now?
Yes, thank you for the question. Well, firstly, there is the members' interests, which are, because I'm a sitting member at the moment, that is up to date and complete. If there was a circumstance where we were discussing something that does cut across one of my interests, then I would, of course, declare that, whether that was in a sitting, either in Tynwald and LegCo, or even in a committee, and in fact even in department as well. So I'm very, very aware of the processes around that, and very keen to make sure that is accurate.
Thank you. Mr. Cleater.
Okay, in my opening statement I did explain that I'm involved with an awful lot of different parts of the business community on the Isle of Man. That's supposed to give you the idea that I do know what's going on with business on the Isle of Man, and I understand the frustrations of most of the small business owners on the Isle of Man, or whichever ones I've come across anyway. So if a conflict of interest was likely to come up, then I would have to declare it. I realise that. I'm involved with people who are in e-gaming, much the same as Rob was, and I'm involved with people who do property rental, so I can see their frustrations when taxation gets put on 20% of their income when they can't potentially increase their what they're actually charging for their properties. How that's dealt with, I'm going to have to learn, but I know so many people on the island, I can't just list them for you now. It will be something that would come up at the time, and I would be honest about it. I think that's all I can say on that.
Thank you. Ms. Bell.
Okay, so I work for Manx Care. If I were to be successful, I would obviously leave that post. I am a member of the dyslexia advocacy group at IOM, but it's not registered. If I were to be successful, I would also drop that, and if someone wanted to take it on, then fantastic, and if it didn't, it would probably fizzle out. I think that would be my only conflict of interest, which wouldn't actually be relevant if I got post, because I would leave those two. I am a member of the NMC, which is Nursing of Midwifery and Counsel, and I am a member of the BABCP, which is the British Association of the Behavioural and Cognitive Psychotherapies. I don't think that would be a conflict of interest. I think it's just where my background is in mental health. Obviously, if I came across anything that I did think was be a conflict of interest, I would declare it, as I do now currently in my current post when working with patients.
Thank you. Mrs. Sharp.
Thank you, and thank you, Ms. Edge, for your question. Any affiliations that I have would be listed on my members' interest section on the Tynwald website. I think it is something that you have to be constantly aware of whenever you walk into any meeting or whenever you're talking on any subject in Tynwald, for example, or Legislative Council, that you should make any conflict of interest known. The only time I can think of in the past when this has occurred was when I was a member of DHSC and we were involved with a discussion on Live at Home, and I declared that I knew the person who was running that charity at the time and asked whether I should leave the room. In terms of my family, I come from a very ordinary working class family who certainly aren't major movers or shakers in the Isle of Man, so I have no sort of family conflicts there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Perkins.
Thank you. I'm chair of Douglas Lifeboat, and I'm a trustee of the Manx Museum, Manx National Heritage, and I also am involved with the organ donation charity. And I'm absolutely meticulous in making sure that I don't encounter a conflict of interest. And when the Manx Utilities proposed to put the sewage scheme down in Laxey, I happened to be chair of the planning committee. And I had to keep the record straight, recuse myself from the chair of the committee and could not get involved with it. And that really tested my integrity, because it was apparent to me that that was the best solution for Laxey. They bought the land at the Cairn site. Gravity would have done everything and the sewage would have been disposed of quite neatly. But there was a big kickback against it and people decided otherwise. And had I been on the committee, I could have argued quite severely that we should have passed it, but it wasn't passed and that was it. So that was a big test of my integrity. I think going forward, in a small community in which we live, you do have to be careful of any thing that might crop up like this. And one of the things that really gets my goat, you see on Facebook, particularly with the planning committee, it must be the brown envelopes. The boys are all in it together. And I think for that reason, you have to be absolutely meticulous that you do not give any inkling, or make sure you recuse yourself from anything that could lead to that allegations.
Thank you very much. Mr. Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Ms. Edge, for the question. Transparency, openness are certainly things that I have always operated with. I can confirm I have no other conflicts of interest or other remunerated roles, and never have since I was elected first time round to the House of Keys. In fact, I gave up my health service role to come into Tynwald in the first place. So to clear off any potential conflicts or distractions even, because I've seen in the past members with multi-roles outside of this place, and it certainly was a distraction, and I don't believe that should be the case. I've got my members' interests in the members' register. That's up to date and fully declared. Not that there's anything to declare, because I am not a Jeff Bezos of this world, far from it. And also, if in a situation within debate or committee work where it was obvious there may be a conflict of interest, I would declare it at the outset of the meeting, or certainly draw it to the chair's attention during whatever proceedings to make a point of order and possibly remove myself. I see it as a MLC, MHK, Tynwald members' solemn duty as we take the oath and the Tynwald standards that we aspire to and Tynwald protocols, that we should at all times remain transparent, open, honest and reflective in what we do.
Thank you very much. Ms. Newell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Ms. Edge, for your question. I have no conflicts of interest, but as a serving civil servant, mouthful, I would be aware of any privileged information, because I work for Manx Care at the moment, so I would just be aware for a little while after taking up post if I was in a meeting, then that, you know, I would recuse myself from that. I would be resigning from my post, and this would be my only role. The only thing I have to declare for the members' interests, I'm a fellow of the Institute of Administrative Management, but that doesn't have any impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Moore.
So in relation to declarations of interest, I obviously am a practising social worker, and can't believe I've just realised I'm going to have to say this. I would have to resign after 25 years of doing that, which is quite a scary thing to say. I'm registered with the Social Work England, which we have to be, and actually this role would enable me to continue being registered with Social Work England, because obviously developing legislation is an aspect of social work. I'm a member of the British Association of Social Workers, and I would also maintain this. This ensures that I remain up to date with legislation from all over the world, policy and guidance shifts, and actually is very useful in gathering practical advice, particularly from practising social workers in the UK. I am a member of the Social Workers Union, but obviously if I wasn't practising social work, I wouldn't need that protection, so that'd be a little bit more money in my pocket. I'm unsure of the regulations when it comes to declaring any business interest. My husband has, and I'd have to check that out. I haven't looked into that. In relation to conflicts of interest, impartiality is only as good as the research you get. So that is what I would be concentrating on in the role as Minister of the Legislative Council. One of my skill sets is evidence-based and critical thinking, and this has been well tested in courts, public inquiries, serious case reviews. And I also have integrity, and any decisions will be made using my core values and evidence base that can be clearly explained and justified should this be necessary.
Thank you very much. As there's no one else on my list from the panel, I'm going to use my question. What are your thoughts on the Manx budget process, and how would you improve it, if at all? First one on this one, Mr. Cleater.
Oh, if I could just get my notes on the budget. There's a question.
So this is a lesson to members, so get their hands up early.
Yeah, please get your hands up early.
Mr. Cleater.
Well, I've looked very quickly at the Pink Book. It's incredibly detailed, and it's going to make fascinating reading as I get deeper into it. The process, from what I can see, is one where lots of advice must come in from civil servants to Dr. Allinson. There's loads and loads and loads of different sides to it, but ultimately it appears it balances if you get this injection from the reserves of 110 million, and Dr. Allinson suggests that that's actually okay, because that money is going to be made up from the interest from the reserves that are in place, as far as I can tell. Couldn't quite see that in the actual full Pink Book, but that's what he says so far. Ultimately, it looks to me like the Isle of Man needs to save an awful lot of money, because it's all very well there being reserves there now. Somebody's put that together. Somebody very clever in the past has made sure that the government has some healthy reserves, and we've been digging into them for years. It does seem that the Treasury Minister doesn't have much, doesn't really have many options. When departments overspend, ultimately they've overspent, and that money is actually required. It's going to come back to the government efficiency and pulling everybody, reining all of those civil servants in. As far as I can see, reducing wages would be quite a good start, but that wouldn't be very popular, would it? And dealing with the public pension scheme and the funding that requires, which off the top of my head was about another £30 million injection per year for the public pension scheme to actually go ahead, and that was only going to increase year on year. The whole thing needs a major review, how it's operating, and it basically is too much for the Isle of Man, much like Martin said.
So, thank you. Ms. Bell.
So my observations of the budget is that it was in line partly with what the KMPG report said about trying to increase personal allowance and increase the tax cap to allow people on low incomes or middle incomes to have more money in their pockets, which I think is the main headline of the budget. So I am in favour of going in that direction. I don't think we're entirely there yet, especially when we compare ourselves to the United Kingdom. For example, national insurance on the Isle of Man for employees is 8% versus 12% in the UK, and the threshold to start paying national insurance is, even though it has been increased, it's still nowhere near in line with what the UK is. And so I think the comments that have been made in the budget is that skilled professionals who have just newly qualified, like newly qualified nurses, newly qualified teachers, they are getting less money on the Isle of Man compared to the UK when you combine tax and combine national insurance, because of the higher cost of living here. So I would like to see in future budgets that direction of it continues, whereby perhaps the tax cap increases slightly each year. What I would like to see different is that once we know what money is being sent to which departments, there's also a breakdown, and maybe this does exist, but I don't think so, a breakdown of where exactly is the money going, by a very clear, well-defined breakdown. Thank you.
Very much. Mrs. Sharp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your question. So my thoughts on the budget process as a process. I think that the current process whereby we receive the pink book about a month in advance, it certainly doesn't give us time as members of the legislature to really input on what we think are the areas that we think money should be spent on. I've been lucky enough to do the McGill Advanced Parliamentary Governance course, and on that course we looked at different parliaments across the world and different parliamentary benchmarks. And certainly, I mean, if you look at parliamentary benchmarks, they do state that the legislature should have input and discussion into a budget, and that's something that we don't really have. And certainly for the public as well, the public don't get to see what's in the budget until the day of the budget itself. I've also been lucky enough to go on exchange study courses with the Scottish Parliament at Westminster, Jersey and Guernsey, and to talk to other parliamentarians about their budgetary processes. Something that we could perhaps look at is having a longer amount of time for members to input into a budget and draw out the themes that they want to look at. We could also look, as part of the process, perhaps at involving I'm losing my thread here, I do apologise. We could look at new members when they come in as MHKs or MLCs, having more education in how to actually get to the bottom of a budget.
Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The budget at the moment, the way we vote on it, is all or nothing. You ain't got a choice. You either accept it or you don't accept it. And what that means is there are certain MHKs that always vote against it because they can say to their constituents, oh, I didn't vote for that budget, it's a load of rubbish. And I think what we need to do is we need to break it down and have a public discussion on what is areas of the budget that we need to look at, 3 or 4 areas, so that broadly you could accept that part of it, but there's other areas that you would not accept. And I think that would generate a much more clear and concise message of where we're going and help our finances in that area. The Pink Book should be published earlier, I think, and it should be open to public scrutiny before the budget actually goes to Tynwald, and the public should be given the opportunity to lobby the MHKs, which doesn't really happen at the moment. And I think there's, with AI as well, that will also help the budget process. So we need to progress and look at that, because I believe that the open scrutiny cannot be done as we are at the moment, and it's almost a fait accompli. You either vote for it or you don't, and I think that has to be thoroughly examined in the next few years, because I believe it is stifling the process. Thank you.
Mr Henderson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and for your question. I have to say that having been involved in the budget process many times directly as my membership within Treasury, it is a hugely complicated administrative and management process, accountancy process. From the plans have already started now for next year's budget. Even though we've just received this, that will tell you the complexities of it. And it's not something that can be produced 6 months hence and open to public scrutiny. It takes a lot longer than that. There's negotiations, there's meetings, there's council ministers meetings, there's council ministers approvals. It's a hugely drawn out, and if there was any bureaucratic process within government, this is one such thing, but it has to be fair, open and transparent in how the figures are arrived at. We're no different to many other countries in this process, and in fact if you're in the UK, the first you get to know about the budget when the Chancellor stands up and delivers his speech. So the Isle of Man is way ahead as far as that's concerned, because members have had a lot more time than 2-minute notice as in the UK. I believe there can be improvements made, and I fully support Mr Speaker's concerns, and we need to go out, canvass members' opinions, and yes, another workshop may need to be held, public opinion, to see what can be practically achieved and see how we could move the system forward in a better way than where we are now.
Thank you. Ms Newell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, for your question, I think. The budget, would I change it? I feel I don't have enough information of the actual process to get to the point of making it public to provide a yes to that question. What I can say is that I would be looking to see where government can grow their income, and back to Mr Glover's question about efficiencies needing to be increased within government to perhaps pick that up. Departments need to start or continue potentially to look very, very hard at their outgoings and whether they're necessary for the department, where they can perhaps gain income. Using so much of our reserves year on year is unpalatable for us as well as the public, and we need to work differently to avoid this. What do I think of it? As Mr Henderson says, it's a bit of a fait accompli when it comes to the vote at this point, but would I have voted for it? Don't know at this point. Possibly yes, but...
Thank you. Ms Morphy.
Okay, so firstly, the budget and how to improve it. I definitely do not envy anyone who has to take on that task. It seems like you can't win whatever you do with that task. However, as I have repeatedly said so far, for me to make any decisions, I need information, and to analyse information, I need time. So I have no idea how much information you would receive prior to this. So at this point in time, I can't say whether that is enough time, but that would be my priority, is that I have enough time to analyse so that I can make a fully informed decision. When you're talking about the timing of it as well, I will just say on behalf of many of the MHKs I've spoken to, they all highlighted that the timing of the LegCo elections alongside the budget process was not particularly helpful for them. So that's something that they highlighted. I do worry about the deficit and planning for the future. I have had to support and fund my daughter through university, getting on the property ladder, worrying about her becoming a mum and how she's going to manage. And these are all things that, you know, the population coming through are going to have to deal with, this deficit that we're leaving behind. I also think that the triple lock pension issue highlighted maybe that there was need for further discussion. But in a whole with the budget, I definitely welcome the call for fiscal responsibility, and I am unsure in the information that they get for the budget how much evidence they get from the individual departments about how much money actually benefits the individual, how much goes to that individual member of the population.
Thank you very much. Mr Mercer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. for the question about budget process. As others have said, it is currently an all or nothing vote. And there have been suggestions for debate on principles first, prior to the finalising of the Pink Book. Other places, a good example I came across was the Republic of Ireland, who use a ratio-based process for setting their budget, which is something I thought was worth investigating further. In fact, reflecting on it a little bit more, I think a comparative review of our neighbouring jurisdictions and their processes might yield some good intelligence as to how we might improve our processes for the benefit of the public and for honourable members.
Thank you. Now, at that point, I did promise that we'd have a half-time break, and this seems to be an appropriate time just to take 5 minutes. So if anyone on this side of the table would like to use the bathrooms, there is one just up through here, which I'll show you to. But we'll be back in and we'll start again at 11.
of your responses so far. One of the issues that we increasingly, it seems, face is trust in politicians. Can you give me examples of what steps you might take to strengthen public trust in the Legislative Council? Thank you.
Okay, how do you improve trust in the Legislative Council? First one on this one is Miss Bell.
I would say having clear accountability, knowing who's responsible for what, and being accountable for all of the decisions that you make. And the decisions that you don't do. So being accountable for what you don't do is just as important as what you do. Being transparent, making sure that you encourage public engagement, and demonstrating that you're listening to the public. So, for example, there's a variety of methods that we do that. You've got roadshows and the government conference and public consultations. Even going on the radio, even going on Manx Radio regularly is a way of engaging with the public. And trust really is important. And I think you can also show that by perhaps communicating to the public what you are doing, because I think as a member of LegCo, you are behind the scenes a little bit more, and maybe it is less clear to the public on what you do. I think I certainly experienced that myself, of knowing what Keys did, but not LegCo. So I think it's about communicating with the public and actually letting them know what you're doing, and I think that in itself can help with public trust. Thank you.
Mrs. Sharp.
Thank you, Ms. Farragher, for your question there. This sort of goes to the heart of why I was very keen for Tynwald office to produce a Tynwald public engagement strategy. Because I think that it's not just LegCo or Tynwald or Isle of Man government that has this problem when it comes to public mistrust of politicians, and I don't think that it's helped with social media these days either. So what would I do about it to improve trust? I think that there are a number of messages that it would be useful to get out to the public. There's a lot of myth busting that could go on. For example, getting messages out about, what is LegCo and who is in LegCo. There's still a perception that it's a retirement home for old MHKs. So to get out there and myth bust and to encourage interest from previously underrepresented groups, I think is really important. And that's something that I've done with my work with the Commonwealth Parliamentarians with Disabilities Network. I've held a public workshop for the public to come in to talk about getting into politics. I think it's important to get out into schools and talk to children in general, but specifically also girls, to encourage them. I've talked to school groups in Tynwald when they've come to look round and sort of said, look at all these pictures on the wall, what do you think they have in common, And one girl said, they've all got beards. And yeah, they have. And what does that mean? Well, they're all men, yes. So, it's a good opportunity to talk to them about, well, actually, just because everyone you see around you doesn't look like you doesn't mean you can't do that job.
Mr. Sharp.
Thank you.
Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the reason you've answered this question is because the trust in politicians is at an all-time low. And what a bad example the UK have set. When the Conservative government was in, the Labour Party absolutely slagged them off over sleaze and things that should not have gone on, and quite rightly so. When the tables are turned, the same thing happens again. The Labour Party's in government and the Conservatives are pointing out all the sleaze, the free apartments and the clothes, all that stuff, and quite frankly, it's just not a good enough example. And my view of the Isle of Man politicians is we are not like that. We're too close to the community. We have to behave properly and in a proper manner. And I think the way we change public opinion is by, and when I was a politician, you go in the pub on a Friday night and talk to the people in the pub. You go to church on a Sunday, you talk to the people having a coffee after the service. You make yourself available to the public so they see you're a decent person and you really care about the community. One of the toxic things that has got out of control is the fact that in Facebook, people will say something they would never ever say to your face. And it used to really annoy me as chair of planning, the number of times I saw in Facebook, oh yeah, it's the brown envelopes that they're getting, that's why they've passed it. And one particular occasion, I found out who the person was who published that and went round their house and said, are you Mr. So-and-so? Yes. I said, did you put on Facebook the fact that the planning committee had been in receipt of brown envelopes? And they wouldn't admit it, of course. But we need to hold people to account by doing things like that, just occasionally putting the onus back on them to make them realise you can't just go ahead and put stuff on social media. I absolutely believe in free speech, but it comes with a responsibility. And I think we have to have a concerted effort, all politicians on the island, to try and improve things in that manner.
Thank you very much. Mr. Perkins. Mr. Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Ms. Farragher, for the question. A very interesting one. However, improving public trust in LegCo, I think the whole heart of that is engagement with the public in the first place, engagement with the House of Keys members, engagement with Tynwald. It's all about your own personal performance at the core of it, how you're projecting yourself in public, how you're operating in public, what effort you're making. At the end of the day, everything we do is in the public spotlight, it's under public scrutiny. The Isle of Man media are watching and recording everything that we do, and it's up to us to act with integrity and show the public that members of the Legislative Council are an active and professional, or are active and have a professional input into Tynwald and the Legislative Council. Your deeds are your proof, and that will certainly go a long way to improve public trust in LegCo. Although we're very lucky in the Isle of Man, politicians are very close to the community, not so elsewhere, and we can show that we are decent, honourable people with integrity as we go about our duties in the community, and people will respect that. They will respect results, they will respect the work that you've done, and far be it from LegCo being a backroom activity, it can actually be very much a front window activity, and the public will notice this.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Ms. Newell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Ms. Farragher, for your question. I would say I'm independent and will listen to all views and question where I feel necessary. Providing answers when I say on time, I think, is an important part of building that trust. I'm open and honest, and building relationships with the public and being approachable is a key point in all of this. Public perception is varied. I've definitely found that during my journey to here today. Some are interested, some are appalled, and others are quite discriminatory, unfortunately. Social media doesn't help with that whole trust issue. I'm not able to reply to any comments at the moment due to my role as a civil servant. I'm used to this. You just read it if you want to read it, and you just take it on board and off it goes. So I'd certainly continue in that vein. And I feel communication is a must with all stakeholders, and being accountable for your actions, good or bad, is top of that tree for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Morfitt.
Thank you, Ms. Farragher. When talking about trust in politicians, as a social worker, building trust on an individual basis is a key skill, and you will already start from way the bottom, possibly I would say lower than MHKs would in the public's eye. I can transfer these skills to this role, and on a larger scale we build trust with other agencies, for example work I've undertaken with the hospital. And this really helps in moving policy and for individuals. I would say consultation is really important. My research project, directly interviewing clients, carers and workers, speaking to the people that are most likely to be influenced and ensuring you take their views into account. The champions roles, I think, are great. They enable a different way to have these direct discussions. I would also say personal responsibility. Social workers are quite unique, that we have individual responsibility for our clients 24 hours a day. If we're told something on a Friday afternoon, we hold that information all weekend and we have to answer to it if something goes wrong on a Monday. So that level of personal accountability, I feel I can transfer into being an MLC as well. Working with the people who know what it's about, the frontline workers. Again, I keep harking back to this, gathering as much information as possible. There are people on the front line that do these different jobs that are often saying that they don't feel listened to. I think also, again, doing what we say. Never ever promise anything that you know you might not be able to do. And I think sometimes, particularly around the time of elections, that can happen. And finally, having core values that we stick to, challenging respectfully when required.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mercer.
Thank you for the question. The public perception has become very negative about the purpose of Legislative Council. The recent social attitude survey is proof of that. But there is a difference between the purpose of Legislative Council and the perception of how it's selected. Anyone can put themselves forward as a candidate. We are all evidence of that. But many people outside of this place don't know that. So for me, I think education will be a key part of improving public perception, along with a greater degree of communication on our part. Recent elections have introduced greater diversity into the council and a greater degree of age, experience and gender mix from outside the government sector. And I think that's a step in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cleater.
Well, nearly everything's been said, but what springs to mind for me was my understanding of the Legislative Council before I needed to be exposed to the law, legislation, whatever. Peter Caron used to refer to the Legislative Council as the living dead. And I'm quite sure if you're here, you can remember that. So that's presumably the implication being that once you'd been in an MHK, you got shoved up to the to the Legislative Council and presumably didn't have that much to do. Now it's very obvious now to me that there's an awful lot to do. And I'm assuming that used to be done as well. But if I had that opinion, then it's a complete lack of education, and it's also flippant comments and allowing some of this bad press to get out there through whatever source. So yesterday I was played a snippet from the Man in Line, where a particular regular listener stated something along the lines of there's no evidence at all that they do anything. And this is MHKs and MLCs. So the public are hearing on Manx Radio from fairly vocal listeners that our politicians and the Legislative Council aren't really doing anything. It's really, really obvious to me that there's a hell of a lot being done. But the public are being told on a relatively regular, at a high frequency, I think, that they're not doing anything. So education, as Rob's mentioned, I noted down here that perhaps there should be some education in schools at a young age where children understand where the politicians that they do know exist, these high up people with beards, what they do, how they get there, and how important it is, the work that they're actually doing. They're not being lazy and more busy than even I understood.
Thank you very much. Our next question is in the hands of Mrs. Paul Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for putting yourselves forward. My question is, what do you think you will find most difficult for you personally about performing the role of a member of Legislative Council, and how would you prepare to overcome that challenge?
What would you find most difficult personally, and how would you overcome it? First one on this one is Mrs. Sharp. Over to you. Thank you,
Minister, for that question. Certainly not one that I've ever prepared for. What's most difficult? I think for me, I mean, obviously I've been in the role for 7 years. I think for me, one of the most difficult aspects is to switch off. I am and always have been a bit of a workaholic. and I do find it difficult to leave my work behind me, and I think that switching off is an important element to surviving in this role, and I think that if I were to be re-elected, I think I would have to be a bit more rigorous with myself about my carving out time to actually to do more sea swimming or sauna dipping or whatever it is that I want to do. I think for me that is the most difficult thing. Other difficulties. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. That would be the most difficult thing for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank the questioner, because in actual fact, you've reduced the workload by taking out 15 bills that are actually in the legislative forecast. So that has helped. But my particular bugbear would be the sheer volume of papers that you have to go through, and looking at the legislation that is coming through and actually getting right to the bottom of it. There is a sheer amount of legislation, as I said, that is coming through, and it all needs to be examined in depth. You can't skim over the top of it, and you have to really get into the bones of it all. It's not easy, and I'm sure the MHKs would know this, that you probably have to be selective in what you do to do certain things really well, and there's other things that you would have to probably liaise with other members and say, actually, do you know what, that's not my thing, but if it's something I'm really passionate about, I would get that done. And it's the difficulty in actually getting in-depth views on how it goes forward. It's not easy, but I think, as Mrs. Sharp alludes, if you're passionate about something and you really get to grips with it, you suddenly find yourself, it's 2 o'clock in the morning and crikey, I should have gone to bed and got sorted out my own particular well-being. And I think it happens to anybody that here is sat on this table today, that you're passionate about something and you really have to take time out to recharge those batteries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Henderson.
Thank you, Mrs. Pill-Wilson, for the question. For me, just straight off the top of my head, back to dealing with public perception again, and really, if re-elected, I'd be re-energising my push to certainly have the Isle of Man media in LegCo sessions more often. Usually they're not present, which answers Ms. Farragher's question back again, to promote the profile of the work that is really actually undertaken in the Legislative Council, or some of it. That certainly needs a huge amount of work. It's difficult to pursue, and I've had difficulty with it, but nonetheless I'm sure there's further work I can do on that. Managing conflict, and I especially point to where there's outside interests expressing issues with something that the Legislative Council are doing legislatively, or indeed something that's come to LegCo from the House of Keys, whereby things are proposed in the Legislative Council following the bill's transit in Keys, which is at odds with the government department promoting that particular bill, and that's proved particularly challenging at times. But that's something, as part of our role, and a raison d'être for Legislative Council is that consultative role, mediating role, and so on, to try and find a path through and produce something, even if it's a compromise that's workable and for the benefit of our community. So that can be quite challenging, but it is part of our role. Dealing with change can be challenging and daunting at times. Again, it's part of our role, it's part of Tynwald members' roles as well, but it's something we should relish. A parliament can't stand still either in an ever-changing world.
Thank you. Ms. Newell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mrs. Pill-Wilson, for your question. As I was thinking about this, for me, I think Mrs. Sharp's comment of switching off resonated with me. In my current role, I invest wholeheartedly in it and the tasks that holds. I love paper, but the amount of paperwork in this role is perhaps something I need to prepare for. And I think also trying to explain to others what the role entails has been interesting to this point. Potentially it would be more difficult onwards, as many things are confidential, so that potentially throws up some difficulties. I guess to mitigate that for myself, I would turn to the things that provide respite from all of that. So my hobbies, I'm into astronomy, cooking, eating out and walking my dog. So those are the things that would mitigate those difficulties, I think, for me. Thank you.
Thank you. It's Morford.
Thank you for the question, Mrs. Paul Wilson. So I have thought about this a lot, actually, before even making my application. And the level of work and the expectations are not what I will struggle with. That's something I'm used to. I can't remember the last time I worked a full-time hour week. It's always over and above. The avoiding burnout is something I have done for a quarter of a century, and if you ever see me driving home looking like I'm screaming, I am actually singing to my music, and that's really helpful. What I will struggle with, and I know this, is that there can't be a right answer for everyone. That there is no such thing as perfection, that I will see my clients individually when I am making decisions, and I will have to ensure that my decisions are not swayed by my emotions, not my emotions only, that all the information is included, kind of the logical, the statistical, the research base, and I know that is what I will probably look for support from colleagues with.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mercer.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think, yes, the most difficult challenge is about finding the balance. I think others have spoken really eloquently on that. How do we address the perception of Legislative Council and reconcile that with the fact that this is not really a front of house role to the same extent that the MHK role is. The work-life balance is important for you to function, properly, and this can become an all-consuming, all-time job. I think finding common ground between opposing views is probably a useful way of managing that challenge. That's certainly what I seek to do in this role. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cleater.
I think rephrasing what Rob has said there is much where I'd be coming from, where I believe the most difficult thing for me would probably be when I fundamentally disagreed with the contents of a proposed bill. And at that time, I would lean heavily, I believe, on my colleagues to see what their view was on it. It's obvious that policy is actually defined by the elected representatives, not by the Legislative Council, and we're just refining and fine-tuning the actual legislation. Also, as things I've said in the past, I'm hoping for reduced complexity of legislation, the Plain Speaking Act and things like that everywhere else has. If we could just reduce how complicated things are, make it easier for the common man to actually read it, that would be ideal. And so I expect clarity regarding replacing existing legislation. All legislation comes at a cost, so just creating the legislation with the cost of the MHKs and the MLCs and everybody else involved, the AG's chambers, which is staggering. There's the creation of it, and then there's the operation and enforcement of the legislation as well, all comes at a cost. So we need to be very careful not to become overregulated. Really serious consideration needs to be put into whether new bills are even required until there's plenty of public consultation. And I think the 15 bills that have been removed recently is a testament to that probably not happening yet. Thank you.
Thank you. Finally on this question, Ms. Bell.
So for me, the very reason why I'm applying is also the very thing that I'm going to miss the most. So I work with people who are struggling with common mental health disorders, and I work with them on a very individual basis, one-on-one, developing, patient-led therapy, and can meet their needs exactly. And, I'm now moving at a population level, wishing to move at a population level in order to have a greater impact. But that comes at a cost, because it means I'm going to miss out on a very personal approach. And just to give an example of this, I have a dripping effect every single day of the difference I make, and I see that. And to give an example, without obviously breaching any confidentiality, there was one patient who couldn't leave their house, and at the end of 12 weeks they'd booked to go travelling to Europe, and the patient did that, but I helped them get there, and that was so rewarding to see. But how I'll overcome that is that reminding myself that, I am making a difference at a population level now, and even though, I won't necessarily get to see the difference at a personal level anymore, I can enjoy other aspects that I love. So I really enjoy networking with people. I really enjoy building relationships. I've got excellent interpersonal skills. I plan to use them with my colleagues and people that I'll work with. And I love learning. That lifelong learning is really important to me, and really getting into the nooks and crannies of the bill and understanding it in detail. And I am a big believer in delayed gratification. So knowing what you're going to make a difference, and knowing, okay, it's not immediately, it's going to be next year or 2 years' time or 4 years' time, but not forgetting delayed gratification, which is sometimes more important than that instant gratification. Thank you.
Now I'm going to ask Mr. Wannenberg to come up and ask his question, and while he does so, I will confess that I am prioritising members who haven't yet asked a question over people who wish to ask a second question. Next, after Mr. Wannenberg, will be Mr. Johnson and then Mrs. Maltby. Of course, all things are independent. But first, Mr. Wannenberg.
Thank you. Real-world experience is very much important. Could the candidates give us an example of how they've been involved in strategic decision-making and what the outcome was that they contributed to? Thank you.
So how have you been involved in strategic decision-making, and we're back around, having done a full cycle, to start with Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. I think really the strategic decision-making I made was the organ donating bill. And before Wales or any of the English, Scotland or England had decided that they would go for the opt-in option, I decided that the Isle of Man needed that, and asked a few people, and it became absolutely clear that we needed the legislation amending to make sure that we opted everybody in. And it would, down the line, have tremendous effect on the people that needed organs and the families that were able to donate organs. And to get the legislation in place was quite an effort, because Brexit was going on originally, and halfway through the decision then had to be taken, do we include the human tissue bill? So it all ramped up, and it sort of was a bit like Topsy. It suddenly grew from a small 30-clause bill into a big bill. And the decision was to lump them all together, so it then went to a 90-clause bill. And to keep that going right through the legislative process, and with the fact that latterly we had all the COVID legislation kicking off, and we then, it was quite an onerous job, but to see that through to completion is good. But the thing that has got my goat, as I said earlier, the secondary legislation hasn't been done, and I haven't quite completed that. So that is my example of that.
Very much. Mr. Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Wallenberg, for an interesting question. Different levels in strategic decision making. There's a personal level where I've brought motions to Tynwald to ask for approval for certain aspects from Tynwald members, raised national concerns. Example, prisoners of war, compensation for ex-Japanese prisoners of war, World War II. Government were not going to recognise that. I pushed the button in Tynwald and got a successful motion. Empty properties was another passion of mine. That took a motion to Tynwald. Looking at government, I brought the motion to Tynwald in 2019 for the new Manx state pension. That was a huge effort and a huge input at the time. Also Treasury work. I've brought to Tynwald Treasury work behind the scenes, working with the Minister and the Treasury Board, making strategic financial and community policy decisions in the background. And certainly Tynwald debates in general, where you have your own input to the debate, you're actually influencing strategic decision making at that level, the highest community level, and also registering your vote and trying to influence members to vote one way or the other, given whatever the particular matter is that's up for debate. So it's a multi-level process as far as I'm concerned, Dr. N.
Thank you very much. Ms Newell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr Wannenberg, for your question. Firstly, I was asked some years ago in a role, I was asked to draft an amendment to some legislation regarding sex offenders and their travel notifications. Whilst looking at that, I noticed a loophole in the notification process. So I took that to Chambers and was asked to draft a clause to close the loophole. I did so and brought that to Tynwald with the then Minister for the department, and that was taken through the process and approved. So for me as well, that's sort of one of my big career moments as well. During my time on the Legal Aid Appeals Tribunal, there's 3 of us, there's the legal chair and then the 2 lay members. So deciding whether we can spend public money providing the legal aid there, obviously that's quite a strategic issue in that regard as well. Not all of them were approved, and some of them are you know, they were quite contentious. And then I've perhaps got a very quick example of whilst I was doing my postgrad studies and the projects that I did for each unit, one of which was the redevelopment of the promenade in Douglas. Not one to shy away from big projects, and I took that to the Minister at the time and showed him my project, and some of those things were actually put in the end project. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms Morfitt.
So I will hark back to when I was the senior practitioner in probation service, and again, as usual, there were budgetary restraints, and we were asked to look at how to reduce the budget for the service. So I completed a full work time flow analysis of all the work that was required by the service and the average time it took from court report writing to sex offender treatment programs. I completed a clear risk and mitigation analysis of what would happen if we didn't do the sex offender treatment work, what would happen if we didn't do as many reports, what would happen if we did. So I then presented this report to the Chief Executive and the Chief Executive Officer and the Minister at the time, which wasn't yourself. And this involved a lot of work as we looked at what we could take out of the service. The result of this was that there was no funding for a recognised risk assessment tool. So I therefore had to go away and design a risk assessment tool for working with offenders, which, as Ms Paul Wilson knows, is quite a complex thing to do. We also designed a template for stand-down reports, which did massively reduce the amount of time that probation officers had to spend. And I'm very surprised that both are still being used today with tweaks, but yeah. And this work was also a protective factor within a subsequent public inquiry, because we were able to evidence that every effort had been taken to protect the service, even with the budgetary restraints.
Thank you very much. Mr Mercer.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I mean, firstly, I'd like to say that, not everyone who applies for a role in Legislative Council will have had the benefit of exposure to strategic decision making. And in fact, 5 years ago, when I first applied for this role, I had come from a largely operational background. And I've somehow managed to resist the temptation to roll my sleeves up and become operational in this role. This is very much a strategic level way of thinking. It's been a big adjustment in my thinking. And you know, running a small business, I suppose you could argue, is almost a series of small strategic decisions, probably, you know, certainly on a fairly frequent basis. But since being elected, of course, I've sat on various committees, including the Standing Committee on Environment and Infrastructure. And what you're looking at there is policy and strategy. And you get a really good feel for that. And also on the committee roles, so I sit on the PSPA and the PSC. Again, these are strategic level governance and oversight roles, and it's something I've found that I've really enjoyed. So my examples really are from within this framework, but I would also argue that they're real world too. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Mr. Cleater.
Well, my examples are going to come from the world of small business on the Isle of Man. Whilst I was in the middle of my awful court situation with the land registry years ago, I recognised that a small website business was struggling. In fact, they'd been operating insolvently. And for a small amount of money, myself and my colleague bought that particular business, and by reducing its costs and increasing its income, we've turned it into what is a perfectly solid, thriving business, which I don't have to have any. In fact, I don't understand most of what it does, to be honest, but it sits there and it works. Another example, perhaps 20 years ago, there was another business that sells hardware, and they were absolutely on their knees, and I was called in by the business owner, who's dead now, unfortunately. I was called in by him to look at their system, and what I did was write a report which at the end of every night produced a list of all of the products that they sold that had gone out below a particular margin that we decided was what needed to be achieved for this business to actually survive. So for the first week I went in there and ran the report with them, and what they did with this report was any items on it then had to have their prices increased. Sometimes it's only £1 or £2, but they had to have their prices increased. And over the next couple of weeks, the report reduced in size, and what happened with the business was that their margin increased, because all of the products that were being sold at the margin that was required to make that business work. And that business is still there today. It's run by somebody else, but it still operates the same margin report. It makes sure everything stays within a proper area where they can run. So the Isle of Man is a micro business.
Apologies. Thank you. Ms. Bell.
There was a point.
I haven't had an opportunity to show strategic decision making at a higher level. However, what I will show is some of the decision makings that I've done, which demonstrates that I have good quality leadership skills, which has led to change. So when I was actually I wasn't even newly qualified, I was a student nurse, and I was on placement at Geddenreach, which was the then psychiatric hospital. I brought in a research paper which showed them that organising groups and educating patients about common mental health disorders would help bring down violence and aggression, and would help foster compassion and empathy towards patients that they were living with. And I ran those groups, and I led it, and patients were in the room, and so were the staff, and I managed to change the culture of that hospital by regularly, every single day, having educational sessions on different mental health disorders, which brought down violence and aggression and fostered compassion and empathy. When I was also a student nurse, I went onto a placement in a learning disability environment, and I learnt that the sensory room was not being used, which I was really disappointed to see, because it was a working sensory room. All what was missing was blackout curtains. And there was lots of reasons why they couldn't get those curtains. So I used my initiative, I got the whole team on board, and I brought in sellotape and black bin bags and made it dark. And I'm then, again, had a culture shift, and I got the service users with learning disabilities using that sensory room. I got the whole team on board with it. Again, when I was a student nurse, it demonstrates that I have those leadership skills to be able to make those strategic decision making. Thank you.
And Mrs. Sharp.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the question. When I came into Tynwald, I identified the fact that there was an issue with public engagement, and that the public didn't understand what Tynwald did, and that this was a problem because when people feel disengaged from the political process, they start to get quite antsy, and you get lots of negative feedback on social media. So I held first a workshop for members who agreed that we should have a public engagement strategy. I then took this to Tynwald Management Committee so that it would have a home. I set up a working group with a select group of Tynwald members, and we drew up our aims and objectives and made sure that they were smart objectives. We then discussed all of this with the Tynwald office and made sure that they were happy, because it was the Tynwald office that would be carrying all of this work out. We took it to the Tynwald Management Committee. I held a presentation of the engagement strategy to Tynwald members and asked for email or feedback, verbal feedback. And now we have our first Tynwald public engagement strategy, and I think it's going to be a really positive thing. There's a toolkit in there which gives different methods which the Tynwald office can use to reach out to different areas of the community, to tell them what we're doing and to invite feedback. And all the research shows that democracy, where people feel engaged with their political members and with the system, makes people happier. Thank you.
Okay, next question is in the hands of Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to all the candidates for being here this morning. Like many Western democracies, this administration has been facing the challenges of an ageing population, a declining birth rate, and the challenges of funding public services. Now, for you, those who are selected in this process, most of your term will be within the next administration. What priorities would you like to see the next administration put forward?
So what priorities would you like to see for the next administration? The first one on this question is Mr. Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for that question. It's a huge, broad range, sweeping question. Where would you start with it? And the thing I would start is that right at the very core of government itself, and that's looking at the income and economics of government, including the budget process, and to see the effectiveness and efficiency of government, look at the delivery of services, look at educating the public's expectation as to what those services should be for a small island, look at productivity in much the vein that we were examining earlier, Mr. Speaker. That's a huge issue, and the government spending pattern, use of reserves. I know the financial plan has us coming into credit in 5 years, but nonetheless that's a priority to keep an eye on, no question of that. Then we fall into the sphere of the National Insurance Fund, and we are under a warning from one of the most renowned actuarial professional bodies, the UK Government Actuarial Department, that our National Insurance Fund will run out in approximately a little over 20 years, and that's something that we need to be very, very wary of and promote the national discussion now that's required, and engage with people, MHKs, members of Tynwald, as to a practical and pragmatic way forward on this issue, not just a single-minded view. And I think that's super important for us to look at in the next administration. Growing the economy is also very, very important, and I'll leave it there, Mr. Speaker.
Ms. Newell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for your question. First of all, we've just had this year's budget, so we're working to that currently. However, looking onwards, looking at the different demographics that you adhere to, I want to focus on the 16 to 21 age group, as they are our future. One thing particularly jumped out at me from the current legislative programme, and it was from the DHSC Children and Young Persons Bill. So the update to this legislation that seeks to bring in what's called leaving care legislation, suggested by Mrs Sharp in her Children's Champion report from 22-23, seeking to legislate the term corporate parent. I think that is something that we really need to be looking at, the age group as well, and that particular demographic of care leavers do fall through the cracks. This particular process of the corporate parent provides financial, pastoral, educational, medical assistance and employability for support for the care leavers, and also aims to provide accommodation for the young person. Yes, of course, that has budgetary impacts for many departments, but I feel that it's something that we should definitely be looking towards for the future. Jersey's support package, for example, in this arena is particularly good, and feel that we should be looking towards that in this area. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Morphy.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for this question, because it's actually one I prepared for. Firstly, sticking within the role of MLC and maintaining the focus on legislation, I would have two. The Housing and Communities Bill, placing a duty on government to provide suitable accommodation for homeless people, not B&B, taking notice of recent Section 34 recommendations from coroner's inquests. The impact of homelessness on the island cannot be underestimated. It has very significant personal impact on a person's development, health, physical, mental and emotional, resilience, self-worth and self-efficacy. These personal costs often become larger costs to the community, with increased risk of physical illness, shorter life expectancy, deterioration of mental health, higher rates of crisis, need for emergency service interventions, increased risk of harmful substance use and overdose, increased risk of suicide, and the list could go on, and they're all research-based figures. Finally, all of these costs have significant long-term and chronic financial implications. Secondly, the Health and Social Care Services Bill. I've been involved in the consultation stages of this process, and obviously with my professional background, this is a piece of legislation that I see as very important. I remain concerned that discussions and decision making about how social care will be funded long term are planned to take place after this legislation is finalised, and this is likely to result in the need for numerous amendments, secondary legislation, if not additional primary legislation. The current way of funding care is unfair and cannot continue. Everyone I have spoken to or worked with requiring care provision would agree with this, even if they've benefited from the unfair nature. The current system leaves people without the care they need, and that they believe they have paid for through their tax and national insurance. It is not possible to deliver the island plan without addressing this issue, the vision of a secure, vibrant and sustainable island.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mercer.
Thank you for the question. Just reflecting back to 1998, when we made this decision to move to the island, we were looking for an attractive place to live and work and raise a family, and we found that here in the community on the Isle of Man. Personally, my priorities at that time, and I would have thought for anyone of that demographic, was education, health, a strong economy, and of course the natural resources, natural beauty that the Isle of Man is. So they were the priorities for me moving here in 1998. I don't think that would be any different for someone who's looking, of a similar age as I was back then, to do the same. In terms of setting priorities, though, those priorities are set by the MHKs, and they are the foundation of the current Island Plan and the economic strategy. So I think the focus immediately right now is to focus on that current Island Plan and that economic strategy, but also to think ahead a little bit to the next administration. But again, the priorities will be set by the elected members, and will form a forthcoming Island Plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cleater.
Okay, well, the ageing population isn't really going to stop. We're keeping people alive for as long as we possibly can. So we can't do anything about that. We have to look after them all of the way through until they die. So the declining population is because it's no longer really a good place to work. If you're a young person, there's a very little chance you're going to get onto the housing ladder. In order to improve that, we need to actually bring work to the Isle of Man one way or another. And there's a lot of things that are stopping that. The civil service, as it stands, is one big machine, and it is really, in my opinion, it's the enemy of business, the way they operate. We need a massive reduction in administration roles within the government. Important things that need to happen, we can use automation to link everything up, and AI is going to help the techs actually link everything up, so that's definitely going to happen as AI is adopted here. As I said, we need to simplify the regulation to reduce the necessity for so much administration in the first place. If we've got lots and lots and lots of rules, then we need lots and lots of people to actually put that into practice. We need to increase private business on the Isle of Man, and we need to reduce the bureaucracy that stifles this growth somehow. We need to find the next magic bullet. And I've got a note here that perhaps we should become a tax haven. The transport costs on the island to and from the Isle of Man need to be reduced. The steam packet is charging a premium for businesses. Whatever that business is, as long as it can be seen, the business will charge it. They won't charge it to a millionaire in his a big Jaguar going to London, but he will charge it to the plumber going to buy some toilets. But they will charge it. So business on the island is a daily challenge. It's not. There's only 88,000 people here.
Next, I have Ms. Bell.
I spoke to the Chief Constable, Mr. Foster, to help me prepare for the hustings along with other significant people in the community. And something that really interested me, connected to mental health, was securing our borders. And I'm really pleased to see that we've got this Securing Our Borders strategy that was launched September 2024. And this is, to prevent serious and organised crime, and the Isle of Man, unfortunately, is a lucrative market because drugs are, unfortunately, 3 times worth the amount as what they are in the UK. So we need a lot of, disincentives and trying to prevent drugs getting here on the Isle of Man. Keeping in mind of the legislative role that I would be in, should I be successful, is that it's really pleasing to see that ANPR, the automated number plate recognition, potentially coming in. I hope that does. I'd also like to see that the police can get access to information so that they can see who is going on our boats to and from the Isle of Man. That Mr. Foster explained to me that unfortunately they aren't able to get access to the manifest, which tells them who's on the boats, and this because of GDPR. And so if we could change legislation to allow that, it might help to prevent drugs getting to the Isle of Man. Also, perhaps making sure that you can't purchase boat tickets with cash only, and also allowing, making sure that when you do go on the boats that you use ID, and all that would add better scrutiny to trying to protect our borders. What comes together with that is the role of immigration. Immigration does play a role in this too, and we need to make sure that we are attracting the right people to the Isle of Man, that that the people who come to the Isle of Man are who they say they are.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Sharp.
Thank you, and thank you to the Minister for his question. What priorities would you like the next administration to put forward? I think, as Mr. Mercer said, it's up to MHKs on the doorstep to set the priorities for an administration. We know from the last time that MHKs went and knocked on doors that housing was the biggest problem, healthcare and education. So in housing, I think although we are doing work, obviously, there's no reason to expect that the whole problem will be solved by the next administration. I think that housing, especially first-time buyers, is still going to be an issue. With healthcare, I think we'll still need to be looking at taking the pressure off the hospital and dealing with people at that high end of health. In education, we've got growing needs of children with additional needs and behavioural issues. So that's something that we have to look at. If I could just look at one thing, I would say we should be concentrating on prevention, early help and early intervention in order to save money later on. So just one example of that I would give would be active travel. If you look at walking to school, for example, a generation ago, 70% of children walked to school. Now it's only 20%. If we were to implement or draw up again an active travel strategy and have some budget put forward for active travel, we could tackle diabetes, for example, because we wouldn't have so many children who are obese. We'd also be dealing with their mental health, because it's been proven that children who walk to school have much better health and can concentrate much better in the classroom. 500,000 tonnes of CO2 is emitted each year just during the school run, so we'd also help with that as well. Thank you.
Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the key things that needs to be looked at and embraced is AI. It is going to absolutely transform what we're doing. And I know that we're on the road to getting it underway at the moment, but in the next administration, it is really going to start giving us some benefits. It'll assist the administration, it'll help in public service, it'll give resource optimization, data-driven decision-making, which is vitally important. Why are we making decisions with only half the information? Healthcare and law enforcement. We all know that healthcare is a big priority as it is, and it will be going forward. I think the government needs to recognise this and do something regarding nursing home, the payments for nursing home for people as the population gets older. It needs to recognise things like NGOs helping government, for example, carers. They are really at the bottom of the pile, and they save the government an absolute fortune. So we need to look at how we encourage the third sector to help government and put some more money in there so that it can actually help people that are really struggling at the moment and need it. Education and security also comes on the back of AI. So AI is the main criteria that takes things forward. The UK Parliament have got a thing called Humphrey, believe it or not, Humphrey in the Parliament, yes, Minister. But that actually tells the ministers which way the MKs are likely to vote. So, it's a phenomenal, powerful tool, and it's going to, go into all aspects of our lives. One other thing that I think, sort of off-the-wall type thing, which I love all these bits and bobs, is I think driverless cars was going to be a big thing. And of course, with an ageing population, some of the people you see driving around shouldn't be on the road anyway. But if you can get a driverless vehicle taking them round, and we have got wealthy pensioners, we should put the legislation in place to be able to have driverless vehicles on our roads. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final question for this session is in the hands of Mrs. Maltby.
First of mine, Mr. Speaker, and thank you all for putting yourself forward for election. On that note, MLCs are currently elected by MHKs. Do you agree with this process, or would you, if elected, use your time in office to seek reform on how the council is structured, for instance, via an appointment commission or public vote?
Okay, how would you reform the Legislative Council? First on this is Ms. Newell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mrs. Maltby, for your question. Do I agree with the process of election? At this moment in time, yes. However, I think having gone through appointments commission type affairs for the legal aid appeals, I find that actually to be quite a different kettle of fish. It's perhaps more open, potentially. I would say you are all here asking questions in a kind of, I'm going to take it as an interview type affair. That is a very similar process with the Appointments Commission, but there are lay members on there with perhaps less vested interest in members. And so yes, would I look to change the process of election? Yes, I think I would. Investigating all possible ideas really, and looking at what's best, and involving the public. I think that's a really important one, and I think it's certainly come up along my journey to here with public perception of being a very closed environment for this election. So yeah, I think bringing the public in would be a really good idea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Morford.
Thank you very much for the question. So I suppose I have to sort of look immediately at the fact that the Lord Lisvane report isn't that old, that there was a lot of consultation, I understand, that went into that process. And having worked for government for a long time, we see a lot of consultations happen that then we need another one, and then we need another one. And I suppose I would ask that whatever is done doesn't take up too much finances, because that was quite a big piece of work. Secondly, if you're looking at a public vote, then my understanding, and obviously I'm very new to this political arena and I'm not particularly politically savvy, is that a public vote would then place MLCs, if that was an island-wide vote, would place MLCs higher than MHKs, which I don't understand really, I suppose, if I'm being completely honest. Finally, you used the words, would I use my time to make these changes and request changes? I suppose I see my job as, firstly, the scrutiny of the legislation, so that is where I would prioritise my time. Secondly, if I'm lucky enough to be on committees and part of a department or something like that, then that would be the next focus of my time. I have many things that I am passionate about, which I think has already come across quite clearly. And where I would prioritise those things, if I have any spare time to prioritise those things, is something I could only say when I was in the post, if I was successful. Thank you.
Rich. Mr. Mercer.
Thank you for the question. So I think the question was, would I seek reform? And I would say my answer to that is no. I personally would not seek reform because it's not, I don't think it should be initiated necessarily by an MLC. It entirely depends on whether the elected members prioritise this. So if it was prioritised, would I support reform? Yes, I would support reform. I do think public engagement is really key to it, and you would have to really consider how that might work in practice. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cleater.
Well, as I understand it at the moment, the MLC's sole role is really to work for the MHKs. We're actually revising and trying to perfect the bills, etc., that you choose to put forwards. So it seems to me of little interest to the public who would do that. It needs to be people who are presumably intelligent enough to look in detail at the legislation. How would you get that over to the members of the public that currently don't really know necessarily what MLCs do? I mean, they hardly know, some of them, what MHKs do. So it seems to me that the public currently shouldn't have a vote, and I could see that going wrong. And also, as was brought up by Kirsty there, if the MLCs did receive a vote, then there's only 8 MLCs, there's 24 MHKs, so theoretically a vote that was a vote by an MLC would carry greater weight than a vote by an MHK, because we've got a large proportion of the Isle of Man that we're actually representing. So the way the system is set up at the moment, it seems that the job is actually to work for the MHKs, so therefore it makes perfect sense that you, the MHKs, are the ones that are scrutinising us and deciding whether or not you want us to actually be looking at the documentation on your behalf. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Powell.
I was asked a similar question on Manx Radio, actually, by Phil Gorn, and I said then that I thought that maybe MLC should be elected by the public. And my reason for giving that at that time was because I thought that maybe, and I don't think this is actually happening, but I think there's a risk that it could happen, is that if we need your votes to keep us in, is there a risk that that scrutinising might be compromised sometimes? Although, and there is a loud voice, there is a public and there's a loud voice at the moment, perhaps coming round because of this election, that they want to be able to vote in the MLCs. But I also think that perhaps there's a voice that we're not hearing too, and I think that I would need to have an understanding of the pros and cons on either side to be fully committed to that. I know that the Liz Vane report suggested that there could be a change. I think the Liz Vane report suggested like a commission, like an independent commission, electing them in that are independent. In terms of whether I would actually initiate a reform, no, I wouldn't. I would rather put my energy into other matters, like the bills that are coming through LegCo, or initiating bills that are not yet there. For example, the Modern Slavery Day Act. That's something that really interests me. And I would very much stick to the role. And I think that there is a risk of looking inwards too much and therefore not enacting enough change to the public. Yeah, I think I'll keep it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Sharp.
Thank you, and thank you to Mrs. Maltby for your question. I think MHKs know what mix of skills they want to have in the Legislative Council, so I'm happy for them to vote for MLCs. On the other hand, there is a growing public concern that this somehow makes the whole process closed, even though the votes are known and we are being filmed, so the public has got access. One possibility which has been mentioned is that we could have an all-Ireland election, but you would need to do a lot of education on what LegCo does, and also what would you do if you ended up with 8 lawyers, for example, on LegCo. I mean, no offence to lawyers, but even lawyers would say they didn't want 8 lawyers. You could have a public panel to select MLCs to ensure a mix of skills, but who would you put on the panel and how would you decide who was going to be on the panel? So I think, ultimately, as Mr. Mercer said, it is up to the elected members to decide on what system works for them and whether they want to change the system or not. Thank you.
Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a really good question because obviously it's a hot potato out in the public at the moment. If you have a general election for MLCs, you would end up with super senators like they have in Jersey. Now, Jersey, look at the Isle of Man as a virtuous place. It's much better than us. And of course, we get told that Jersey is better than us. And so either side has, whichever way you look at it, has pros and cons. I personally come down alongside the fact that the MHKs know who they're looking for. And as Mrs. Sharp says, they want a good mix of people with all sorts of different skills. And I don't know about the rest of you, but when I was asking for support for the MHKs, they all said, yeah, we'll get you to the Hustings, but we can't guarantee we'll vote for you, which I think shows how open and transparent it is. And coming to the question of patronage, I don't think that any of us looking at the law would support some MHK just because they put it through. You would look at what is in front of you and hopefully have the integrity, and I'm sure most of us would have the integrity of looking at how that will benefit the island, not just supporting some MHK so they might get back in at the next election. And the other beauty of MLCs is you can speak out, you can say exactly how it is without fear of losing the public mandate. And I think that is an essential part of our political process. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Henderson.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Sarah, for the question. This whole issue has been live since at least 2015, once the Lisvane inquiry was launched sometime after that. Tynwald has been round and round and round in circles, committees, the functioning of Tynwald committee headed up by Mr. Speaker, recommendation after recommendation after recommendation, debate, 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 debate. All the votes have been taken numerous times, and one of the things that was thrown out of the Lisvane report and its recommendation was an appointments commission. We didn't like it. Reason is that the Isle of Man has one of the best unique parliamentary systems on the planet. Everyone else who comes here and looks at this place, clerks, court officers, parliamentarians, call them what you will, all say the same thing. Flippin' heck, I wish we had this system. LegCo is elected indirectly by the elected representatives. How more fair a system can you get than that? Everywhere else is appointments or personal approvals, completely undemocratic. Our system, at least, is halfway there. It is open, it's completely open, and the changes following LegCo elections from a couple of years ago, from the secret vote to the open vote, how we're doing things today, it's completely open. Those who are saying it's not open, it is. It's in the full glare of the public spotlight. Phil Gorn off Manx Radio has done an exceptional job interviewing everyone, throwing it up into the public spotlight all the time. If you have MLCs who are nationally elected, they will take on senatorial status, and that was thrown out years ago.
Well, we have no more time for questions. We just about have time for everyone to do their closing statements before 12:30 finish. We'll stick with the order that we've got in so far, and the first to their closing statement is Miss Morford.
Okay, so firstly, I would just like to say thank you for listening to us all. And I know that, for one, I'm really grateful that this part is nearly over. I understand that you have another afternoon of this to go, and I applaud your patience. If this had been advertised as a government post outside of politics, I would have applied. If the job had been broken down to its core competencies, I would meet all of the essential and desirable criteria. The academic side interests me. The ability to do research, analyse, debate and come to evidence-based conclusions are activities that I have evidenced my skills. I have received a distinction in my Masters and also completed a postgrad in mental health legislation, and I'm an approved mental health professional. I have a wide and varied understanding of legislation, from criminal justice, health and social care, social security, mental health, to name but a few. Many of my friends, family, colleagues, but more importantly my clients, have all said that I am exactly what is needed. Personally, applying for the role was also important. This was a way for me to pay respect to my clients, past and current, and advocate for them, ensuring that real-life experience of legislation, or the lack of, is heard and considered. It can often feel on the front line that your voice, knowledge, passion and experience is not heard, and this was an opportunity for me to proactively do something. If I want systemic change, then the best way is to be part of it. Being an MLC would allow me to continue to advocate for the Manx public on a macro scale. It is an opportunity to be part of something bigger. So in closing, if you want someone who cares passionately about the island and its population, who understands legislation and the importance of good legislation, who will be honest and hardworking, will challenge and support, has a unique and varied understanding of the population, who has all the necessary skills to scrutinise legislation, then I have evidence throughout this process that I am that person, and you should vote for me next Tuesday to be a Minister of the Legislative Council. I thank you again for listening, and I am happy to have further discussions with anyone if you require additional proof of my suitability.
Thank you. Mr. Mercer.
Guru Mayo, Alton and Honourable Lord. Thank you for the opportunity to present my case, and especially to my proposer, seconder and assenters for nominating me for this important role. If you decide to call me again to serve a second term as a member of the Legislative Council, I bring a wide variety of life skills and experience. My technical ability and varied business background will complement the abilities and corporate knowledge of the Legislative Council. I'll bring a dispassionate and objective view to the role. I've thoroughly enjoyed my time as a member of the Legislative Council. The role has been one of attention to detail, the identification of gaps in knowledge, sharing information with people, and providing constructive challenge. I've demonstrated that I can engage with people from all walks of life and find common ground. That ability to connect and engage will also enable me to be an effective communicator with the wider public. My family and I have made our home here, and we wish to see it thrive and flourish. As the world's only biosphere nation, the Isle of Man has a unique character and determination, and I count myself a fortunate man to have put down roots and made a life here. If I'm called again to serve, I will honour the role of MLC and the traditions of Tynwald, whilst helping their evolution to match the challenges of this 21st century. Our island is a special place to us all. I hope that you'll grant me the privilege of serving it. Guramayu.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cleater.
Mr. Speaker, honourable members, I am known to be a very practical, hands-on and useful person. Beyond that, I am equally adept at writing contracts, configuring multi-currency accounts, forensically checking VAT records, and I can truthfully say that this experience covers a very wide base. For instance, my time within the music industry, both professionally and otherwise, has brought me into direct contact with the younger generation, which has allowed me to get an insight into their particular daily struggles. And of course, I am the father of two 17-year-old girls, so quite naturally I have an overriding interest in ensuring that their futures, if they choose to stay on the island, are secure. Throughout the years, I've been lucky enough to work alongside many well-known business owners on our island, and I have a reputation for clear, meaningful advice. Similarly, a position in the Legislative Council is one of trust, requiring a steady hand and diverse experience. Legislation is perhaps never perfect, and it is ultimately tested in the courts. Unintended consequences from ambiguous or incomplete law can arise, where a lawful result might make no sense to the common man, and when manipulated effectively can actually lead to devastating results. To identify potential pitfalls in proposed legislation, those tasked with ensuring its efficacy must have the ability to think laterally, outside the box, in a way which hopefully identifies any unintended consequences, which otherwise might have gone unnoticed. Members, if you consider other candidates would be more capable than I, then of course, for the sake of our island, they should receive your vote. But I know I could contribute something really positive to the work of the Legislative Council and of Tynwald, and that is why I am offering my services for this very important and precise work. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Bell.
I am renowned for being an excellent nurse because of my advocacy skills. When I was newly qualified, I phoned an ambulance twice because I had significant concerns for one of my patients. Other professionals did not share my concerns. They assumed I was inexperienced, and I had the courage to continue advocating at a time when this patient couldn't due to lacking capacity. By advocating, it led to the patient being admitted to hospital, and it became evident that this is where the person needed to be. It was a very proud moment for me because although the patient sadly passed away, I prompted end-of-life care. What does this mean for the role of MLC? It means I will be the voice to those who are most vulnerable in our society. I will strive to reduce inequalities of health, champion mental health and the determinants of health. I will act with the highest of moral standards. I am a mental health nurse and a psychotherapist, so putting patients first is at the heart of what I do, and this quality is transferable to LegCo in putting Isle of Man residents first. I have good insight into my preferences, my beliefs and my values. and this awareness will reduce personal bias in decision making, of which will be informed. My motto is, the more you know, the more you realise what you don't know. And it is what I don't know that is important to me. And I have the skills and the volition to find out and learn, and I will be meticulous about it. I am open to changing my mind based on new information, and I carefully listen and consider the views of others. I have excellent analytical skills, which developed when writing at degree and master's level. Senior managers of Manx Care have often complimented my analytical skills, saying they are impressive, which have been observed during complex panel meetings, which has led to desirable outcomes for my patients. And seeing situations from multiple perspectives comes naturally to me, because it is a skill I teach using CBT. And I have connections with people across the lifespan. I've worked with older people in dementia care, which is relevant due to an ageing population. I am in the 20 to 40s age category, which is relevant to try to reduce the dependency ratio. And I have a young child and a teenager, of which has additional educational needs. And I think this makes me relatable. And I have a strong work ethic, and I persist long after others have given up. I climbed Kilimanjaro twice to reach the summit, and I petitioned for dyslexia twice to be successful. So I've shown that I do have integrity, perseverance, tenacity, and all these qualities are invaluable to the role of MLC. Thank you.
Mrs. Sharp.
Mr. Speaker, honourable members, 7 years ago when I joined the Legislative Council, the President at the time quoted Macaulay. Do not hesitate to disoblige the few who have access to you in favour of the many who do not have access to you and who you will never see. In other words, look at the bigger picture, don't just listen to those who shout the loudest. Honourable members, I have tried my best to stick to this advice. In terms of legislative scrutiny, the amendments I've successfully moved have, in their small way, enhanced our legislation. With the Abortion Reform Bill, I introduced a new Clause 12, meaning the disposal of fetal tissue is carried out sensitively. In the Communications Bill, I opened up the definition of public service broadcaster to include Manx Radio and the possibility of other media providers, therefore future-proofing the bill. And with the recent Employment Amendment Bill, I considered pregnant women who might not have family members living on the island and added birthing partner to the list of those who have the employment right to accompany a pregnant woman to an antenatal appointment. During the global pandemic, I successfully moved through Council the Regulation of Care Amendment Bill, the Children and Young Persons Amendment Bill, the Limitation Childhood Abuse Bill, the Manx Care Bill and the Medicines Amendment Bill, whilst also dealing with COVID regulations, business as usual, and being a member of the Department of Health and Social Care. In terms of committee membership, I've worked with colleagues to improve government's whistleblowing policy, patient engagement, transport accessibility, and accommodation for vulnerable young people. I've helped revise Tynwald sitting times to appeal to a wider demographic of prospective members and enhance Tynwald's public engagement with hard-to-reach groups, something I would like the opportunity to advance further. Honourable members, I believe I have been effective and I have delivered. I have a solid foundation of knowledge and experience, and I am ready to commit to the next 5 years. I hope you will give me the opportunity to continue our work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honourable members, looking at the makeup of LegCo at the moment, only 6 have had the pleasure and the delight of taking part in a Manx general election. None of them have received the public mandate, which seems to be a bit of a hot potato at the moment. From memory, the colourful Dominic Delaney was in, then out, and then in again. The Claire Christian, not the lady in the front row here, from Maccled, she lost her seat at the election and came back into LegCo and went on to become Minister of Health and the first Madam President. Had those politicians not been given the opportunity to get into LegCo because they'd lost the general election, the island would have been a much poorer place, certainly legislation-wise. The island needs people with a forward vision of what might be achieved, and that, coupled with enabling legislation, should give us the competitive edge on attracting the next big thing for our economy and improving the public well-being. I offer a vision and a proven track record in legislation. I'm a person who has worked productively with MHKs and civil servants. If elected, I will be fully effective on day one and someone who will fearlessly take on the establishment on a point of principle if needed. And with that, honourable members, I leave you with the decision. Is it better the devil you know, who has a proven track record and experience, or otherwise? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, honourable members, for your time today. It's very much appreciated. I've spent a near lifetime helping individuals, groups and communities. In this, I first drew on my health service experience as a mental health professional, healthcare staff representative and latterly as a member of the Legislative Council in Tynwald. To be an advocate for individuals, groups and communities is a quality to which I have always sought to aspire, to serve as a voice for those who are rarely heard or who find it difficult to make representations. To this end, I have found that I can achieve more for a greater number of people and our community by serving as a member of the Legislative Council and Tynwald, working towards the common good. Such as when I progressed and moved the Credit Union Bill in the Legislative Council, especially beneficial and important for disadvantaged and vulnerable members of our society. The Gas Regulation Amendment Bill 2023, providing powers in certain circumstances to protect vulnerable and disadvantaged people in a more socially responsible way. I moved an empty properties initiative Tynwald motion, a personal initiative to highlight the number of empty properties around the island against a backdrop of housing shortages, still a current issue, and to assess how we could reduce that number to meet community housing needs, now being taken up seriously by government. Promoting equality and diversity are hugely important to me. Implementing equitable legislation is vital, helping to formulate and support fair social legislation and policy for people of the Isle of Man. I've also been able to achieve these ambitions using my experience in my capacity as an MLC by submitting extensive contributions to Tynwald committees, providing comprehensive researched and evidence-based documents on subjects such as poverty, suicide and Sir Jonathan Michael's call for evidence in the formulation of Manx Care. Legislative scrutiny, examination and review are key aspects of an MLC's duties. This provides the quality assurance check required to ensure we have, as far as possible, legislation that is fit for purpose. This is vitally important because what MLCs and working as members of Tynwald approve will in one way or another have a lasting effect on the social, cultural, economic well-being of the Isle of Man community. To this end, I have applied my extensive practical experience. I'm also an advocate for change and reform where it is necessary, evidenced by my support for the functioning of Tynwald Select Committee's recommendations following the Lisvane review of Tynwald. It is this duty to deliver for the benefit of our community on our island that motivates me to serve as a Manx parliamentarian and as an MLC. Guramayo.
Thank you very much. Ms Newell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you, members, for your questions today. Prepping for this has been one of the hardest things I've done in a long time. It's been a very interesting process. I have so much inside of me to give to you and the members of the public. Public service motivation is a real thing and I have it in spades. I want to make a difference, to continue to make the island a wonderful place to live and work. I will stand up for what is right, even if that means standing on my own. I will not compromise my strong moral compass or integrity. Just recently, during the conference, I spoke to members about a clause in the Reproductive Rights Bill that has yet to be put before Keys, making them aware of the issues that may be raised by members of the public or members of House of Keys, as an example of scrutiny. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank members for their time and support, and particularly thank Dr. Allington, Mrs. Corlett, Mrs. Maltby and Ms. Farragher. I appreciate the faith you have shown in me throughout this process. I would like to close by reiterating my commitment to the role of MLC and to the Isle of Man. For 22 years I've lived and worked here through good times and bad, but my need and want to make the island a place for everyone to thrive has never wavered. If I'm elected, rest assured I will do my utmost to fulfil the duties of the role to the best of my abilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that concludes closing statements. So can I offer my congratulations to candidates for their answers today. I don't think anyone in here is under any illusion just how daunting this process is and the experience that you've had this morning. So can I ask honourable members if you'll join me in thanking all the candidates for participation in the process so far. Thank you. And with that, I declare the proceedings closed.